The elevator was already moving when Audrey Bellamy stepped inside. She didn't look up. She hadn't looked up at much of anything in the past 16 hours. Her feet hurt in a way that felt permanent now, like the ache had fused into the bone and decided to stay. She was carrying an empty coffee cup she'd forgotten to throw away somewhere around hour 12, and her hair was half out of its clip, and she smelled like antiseptic and the vending machine cheese crackers she'd inhaled standing over a sink at 9 p. She pressed 4. The man in the corner pressed nothing. Audrey noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit, not alarmed, just aware. The elevator was already moving upward. The man hadn't pressed a floor. He was just standing there in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, completely, hands loose at his sides, watching the numbers climb with the absolute patience of someone who had never once in his life been in a hurry because he was late. He was in a hurry because he was choosing to be. That distinction, she wouldn't understand it for another 4 minutes. But it was already true. The elevator stopped between 3 and 4. Not at a floor. Between floors. The lights did something ugly, one hard flicker, then a dim, buzzing half-life that made the walls look jaundiced. The display above the doors showed nothing. Just a blinking dash where a number should have been. Audrey looked up at the ceiling like that would help. It didn't. She pressed the door open button. Nothing. She pressed 4 again. Nothing. She reached for the emergency button, and the man in the charcoal suit said quietly, without moving, "Don't." She turned around. Up close, Ronan Whitlock had a face that didn't give much away. He was somewhere in his late 30s, hard jaw, dark eyes that didn't blink at the same rate normal people's did. A stillness about him that was too deliberate to be calm. Calm people don't work at being calm. This man worked at it constantly. She could feel the effort from 4 feet away. "Excuse me," she said. "The alarm brings security." He said it like he was explaining something simple to someone who wasn't slow, just uninformed. "I'd prefer to avoid that." Audrey stared at him. Her brain, which had been operating on fumes and muscle memory for the better part of a day, ran a fast and unflattering calculation. Expensive suit. No floor selected, preferring to avoid security. Stopped elevator, which, she realized with a cold sliding sensation, might not have been an accident at all. "Did you stop this elevator?" He didn't answer. Which was an answer. "Who are you?" "Nobody you want to know," he said. And then, almost as an afterthought, with no particular warmth, "You're safe." I didn't ask if I was safe. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Just a fraction like a door, opening an inch before the person behind it decides whether to open it further. "No," Sally said. "You didn't." The buzzing overhead light made everything look worse than it was. Audrey set her empty coffee cup on the floor because her hand was starting to feel stupid holding it. She was not panicking. She'd worked critical care for 6 years. She had coded patients at 3 a.m., with equipment that was malfunctioning, and a resident who was less useful than the equipment. She did not panic, but her heart was doing something loud and irregular, and she made a conscious decision to breathe through her nose instead of her mouth. "You're going to 7, she said. It wasn't a question. He'd pressed nothing, which meant he didn't need to press anything because someone else had already handled it. Room 714. The stillness in him changed quality. He looked at her the way people look at something they didn't expect to be sharp. "How do you know that room?" "Because it's the only room on 7, with private security posted outside it," Audrey said. "I've walked past it twice this week during transfers. Whoever's in there checked in, under a name that doesn't match the insurance information. Our billing department flagged it. Nobody upstairs will touch it." She paused. "I'm a nurse. I notice things about patients, even the ones who aren't technically mine." Ronan Whitlock looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "His name is Dashiell Merrick. He's 26 years old. 4 days ago, someone took him. By the time I found him, he was already here. A beat. I don't know what they told this hospital. I don't know what name they used or what story they gave. I know he's on 7, and I know he's been in there for 4 days, without anyone I trust anywhere near him." Audrey heard the word trust and noted where it landed in that sentence. "Is he in danger right now?" "Medical danger. I don't know." "That's the problem. Then Why are you standing in a broken elevator instead of... Because the men outside his room aren't hospital security, Ronan said. They work for the people who put him there. If I walk up to that door with my own men, someone gets hurt. Possibly Dash. Something moved across his face, something that looked uncomfortably like fear, which didn't fit the rest of him at all. I needed a different way in. The elevator hummed. Shifted. The lights stabilized slightly. Audrey picked up her coffee cup. She didn't know why. Habit. You were going to use a nurse, she said slowly. Walk in behind someone in scrubs. Look like you belong. I was going to find a nurse. And then I walked in. And then you walked in, he agreed. She should have pressed the alarm button. She knew that. Every reasonable, self-preserving instinct she possessed was pointing at the emergency button, like a compass needle, finding north. This was not her problem. She did not know Dashiell Merrick. She did not know this man. She had survived 6 years in critical care by understanding which emergencies were hers to run toward and which ones belonged to someone else. But something he'd said was stuck in her head. 4 days without anyone I trust anywhere near him. She knew what that looked like from the other side, a patient with no real advocate. Someone in a bed whose paperwork was wrong, whose treatment had been arranged by people with different priorities than his health. She had seen what happened to those patients. She had watched it happen slowly, and then all at once. If I go up there, she said carefully, and he's in medical trouble, real trouble, you let me do my job. No arguments, no authority. My call on his treatment. Ronan's eyes were unreadable. You haven't agreed yet. I'm establishing terms before I agree. A long pause. Then yes, and nobody in that room hurts anyone on staff. Not tonight. Not because of this, agreed. And after, when he leaves, he goes somewhere with real medical care. Not some backroom setup. I'll arrange it. Audrey looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them was pretending this was a normal conversation. You have a lot of trust in a stranger, she said. I have a lot of trust in someone who just negotiated conditions instead of screaming, Ronan said. Those aren't the same kind of person. The elevator lurched. Climbed. The display blinked back to life 5, 6, 7. The doors opened on the 7th floor. Ronan stepped out first. Audrey hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, the length of time it took her to understand that she had already made the decision, and that the hesitation was just her body catching up to it. She stepped out after him. The men outside room 714 were not dressed like security guards. They were dressed like ordinary visitors, casual clothes, hands in pockets, but they were positioned wrong. Too deliberate, too aware of the hallway in both directions. One of them had his back to the wall in a way that gave him sightlines to the elevator bank, the stairwell door, and the nurse's station simultaneously. Audrey noted all of this without letting it show on her face. She was walking with her hospital badge, clipped to her scrub top and her empty coffee cup in hand, and she looked exactly like what she was, a nurse at the end of a brutal shift who had somewhere to be. Ronan walked beside her at a measured distance, close enough to be plausible, not so close as to seem threatening. At the door, the first man moved to block her. This room is private, he said. His accent was flat, regional, mid-Atlantic, the vowels of someone who'd grown up somewhere industrial. I'm aware, Audrey said. Medication check. Post-surgical IV assessment. It's on the rotation. She said it the way she said everything clinical, without emphasis, without apology, as though explaining it was slightly beneath her, but she was doing it anyway, because she was a professional. You can verify with the nursing station if you'd like. It'll take about 15 minutes to reach the charge nurse at this hour. The man looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at the man. Something passed between them, not words. Pressure. The way two people who understand the same language of consequence communicate without making sound. The man stepped aside. Audrey pushed open the door to room 714. She knew within 12 seconds. Dashiell Merrick was younger than she'd expected, somehow. 26 on paper, but lying in that bed with his face slack and gray, he looked younger than that. He was breathing, but his breathing was wrong, shallow, and too fast, the chest rising with effort that shouldn't be visible at rest. His color was bad. Not emergency bad, not yet, but the kind of bad that was heading somewhere you didn't want to end up. She moved to his bedside without asking permission. His IV line was wrong. She saw it immediately. The insertion angle was off. The tape was pulling, and the drip rate was set for someone 20 pounds heavier than this kid. She checked his temperature. The heat coming off his arm was enough to feel before she'd even reached the thermometer. 101.8. She took it twice. His surgical wound site, whatever they'd done to him, someone had operated, was warm to the touch and slightly swollen at the edges. Not infected. Not yet close. His pulse was 112. Audrey turned around. Ronan was standing just inside the door. His men too had come in behind them, were watching her with the particular wariness of people who weren't used to someone moving through their space like they owned it. His IV is wrong, she said. The rate and the placement. His fever is almost 102. The incision site is inflamed. If this doesn't get corrected in the next hour, you're looking at potential septic progression. She said it plainly. No softening. I need his chart. His actual chart. Whatever the real one says, not whatever name they booked him under. We don't have one of Ronan's men started. Then get it, Audrey said. Or find me whoever did his surgery, because someone has his records somewhere, and I need to know what medications he's on, what the surgical notes say, and whether anyone has been monitoring this wound or just hoping it sorted itself out. The man looked at Ronan. Ronan said quietly, "Get it." The man left. Audrey was already pulling on gloves. She kept a pair in her scrub pocket habit and repositioning the IV needle with the careful, practiced precision of someone who had done this so many times it lived in her hands and not her head. Dash stirred when she touched his arm. Not fully conscious, but closer to the surface than she'd initially thought. His eyes opened partway. Dark eyes. Unfocused. He blinked at her and the light above and the ceiling, and then past her to the door where Ronan was standing. Something happened to his face. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was more complicated than relief, like someone who'd been holding something very heavy for a very long time had just been told they could put it down, but they didn't quite believe it yet. He said, barely above a whisper, "You're late?" Ronan crossed the room in 4 steps. He pulled the chair from the wall and sat down next to the bed with none of the dramatic weight you'd expect from a man of his reputation. Just sat down, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I know," he said, 2 words, no explanation, no defense. Just acknowledgement. Audrey looked away and kept working. The chart arrived 20 minutes later, actual records, pulled from somewhere, handed to her by a man who clearly had not enjoyed obtaining them and was not going to explain how he had. She read through it, standing at the foot of the bed. The surgical notes confirmed what she'd suspected: a wound to the lower abdomen, repaired, but the post-op protocol had been abbreviated. Whoever had set up his care in this room had been managing him on the minimum. Not negligently, but not adequately either. The medication orders were inconsistent with his recorded weight. The IV solution was wrong for someone running a low-grade fever heading upward. It wasn't sabotage. It was carelessness or deliberate undertreatment, someone keeping him stable enough not to die, but not stable enough to recover quickly. Keeping him here, keeping him dependent. She corrected the drip rate. Checked the line again. Made a note in her own handwriting on the back of a glove package because she didn't have anything better. "He needs a different antibiotic," she said to the room in general. "What he's on isn't sufficient for where this wound is heading. I can't just pull something off the shelf. Someone needs to get a specific medication. I'll write it down." "Tell me what you need," Ronan said. "I need a pharmacist, ideally. Or a very good connection to a very legitimate hospital supplier." She looked at him. "Do you have either of those?" He looked back at her with an expression that said the question was slightly funny. "I'll take that as yes," Audrey said. At 12:34 in the morning, Dash's temperature began to drop. Not dramatically, not the cinematic sweat-breaking, crisis-resolving break you saw in movies. It came down the way fevers actually came down gradually, 1/10 of a degree at a time, the body deciding, narvicing, and then a little faster that it was allowed to ease up. Audrey sat in the second chair, which she'd moved from the corner, when her feet had finally filed a formal complaint, and watched his vitals with the focused patience she'd learned in her first year of nursing and never quite unlearned since. Ronan hadn't moved from his chair. He'd been sitting there for almost 2 hours. Not looking at his phone, not talking to his men. Just sitting with Dash in the way people sit with someone when they've been genuinely scared for them, and the fear is only just beginning to loosen. Audrey had seen a lot of people in hospital rooms. Families, friends, strangers pretending to be family. She knew how to read a room by what people did with their hands, where they looked, how often they breathed. Ronan had barely moved for 2 hours. His hands were loose on his knees. He was looking at Dash the way a person looks at something they almost lost. "How long have you known him?" she asked. She didn't know why she asked. Habit, maybe the same instinct that made her talk to patients who were too out of it to talk back, the understanding that a voice helped. Ronan took a moment before answering. 15 years. He was 11. A pause. His mother worked for a woman who worked for me. She died when he was 14. There was no one else. Another pause, shorter. So he stayed. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. "He's not just an employee," she said. "No," Ronan said. "He's not." Audrey looked at Dash's young face, more color in it now, breathing steadier, the IV dripping at the correct rate, and thought about the 4 days Ronan had spent trying to find him. The kind of specific targeted fear that only attaches to people you actually love. "Someone inside your organization," she said slowly. "That's how they knew where to put him, right? So you couldn't find him. Someone told them about Black Ridge." Ronan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Do you know who? Not yet." Dash's eyes opened fully for the first time. He looked clearer, now more present. The fever haze lifted enough that he could focus. He looked at the IV in his arm, then at Audrey, then at Ronan, with an expression that was trying to be dry and not quite managing it, because he was still too tired. "Who?" she asked. "Nurse," Ronan said. "She ours?" "She's hers," Audrey said. "I'm nobody's." Dash looked at her for a moment, with something that might have been the beginning of a grin. "Fair enough. How do you feel?" "Like someone stabbed me." He said it flatly. "Someone did," Audrey said. "Your fever's coming down. You've got an IV that's actually correct now.
Yeah.
You need to drink water when you can manage it, and you need to stop tensing that abdominal muscles, because I can see you doing it, and it's going to pull the repair. It hurts. I know. Breathe through it. Small breaths." He looked at Ronan again. The almost grin had faded. "How bad did it get?" "You were fine," Ronan said. Dash gave him a look. "Ronan." "You are not fine," Ronan said. "You're fine now." There was a long pause. The two of them existed in it, with the ease of people who had been having conversations at partial resolution for a long time and had made their peace with the partial. "The person who started." "Not now," Ronan said. "I know who it is." Ronan went very still. "I've known for 2 days," Dash said. His voice was quieter now, and underneath the quiet was something that sounded like it had cost him something to carry. "I was waiting until I could talk to you. Didn't want to say it to anyone else." Audrey stood up from her chair. "I'm going to step outside and check the hallway," she said. She said it the way she said things she had decided and wasn't asking about, picking up her gloves and moving toward the door. Ronan said, "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Audrey said. "Some things are private. This looks like one of them." She stepped out. In the hallway, the men Ronan had brought were quiet. The building was doing what hospitals did at this hour. Breathing slowly, the PA system silent, the fluorescent lights running at their nighttime register, a little dimmer, a little lonelier. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped at regular intervals. A housekeeping cart moved somewhere she couldn't see. Audrey stood with her back against the wall, outside room 714, and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she had just done. She had walked into a restricted room with a man she didn't know, treated a patient whose real name she'd only learned an hour ago, and was now standing guard in a hallway while a Mafia boss and his injured young lieutenant had a conversation that probably contained information she was better off not having. The strangest part, the part that was going to follow her home and keep her up for the next several nights, was that she did not regret it. She had corrected an IV that was going to cause a serious problem. She had caught an infection before it became sepsis. She had done exactly what she had trained to do, in exactly the situation she had trained for, with exactly the instincts she'd spent 6 years sharpening. That the patient happened to work for a man whose name made Philadelphia nervous was, in the context of a deteriorating post-surgical wound, completely beside the point. Through the door she couldn't make out words. Only the low register of two voices, one tired, one controlled, having a conversation that mattered. The morning shift would start in a few hours. The men outside that room who weren't Ronan's men would return with the next rotation. Whatever Dash had to say, Ronan needed to hear it before the floor woke up. Audrey closed her eyes, leaned her head back against the wall, and started doing the math on how much time they had. The number she came up with was not comfortable. She knocked twice on the door. "You have 90 minutes, she said through the wood. "After that, I need to know you have a discharge plan, because this floor does not stay quiet past 6. From inside, after a pause, Ronan's voice understood. Audrey straightened up, reset her clip, and went to find a working thermometer and whatever passed for coffee at 1A. On the 7th floor of a hospital she was not technically assigned to be in. She had 90 minutes. She was going to use them. 90 minutes turned into 73. That was how long it took for one of Ronan's men, the one posted closest to the stairwell door, to knock twice on the doorframe and say, flatly, without inflection, "Shift rotation." 40 minutes out. Audrey was in the hallway when he said it. She'd spent the last hour doing what she could with what she had scavenged: a blood pressure cuff from the supply cart, 2 rooms down, found a proper thermometer, refilled the IV bag from the floor's locked medication cabinet, using her own credentials and a patient aliasis she was going to feel genuinely bad about later. She'd done it anyway. She'd stood in front of that cabinet, key in hand, and made the calculation with the same flat pragmatism she applied to every impossible choice a night shift eventually handed you. The alternative was a deteriorating patient and a sepsis clock that didn't care about her professional ethics. She'd taken the bag. She'd gone back to room 714 and replaced the drip. Now she stood in the corridor with 40 minutes on the clock and a very clear sense that the next decisions were going to belong to Ronan, not to her. She went back inside. Dash was more alert than he'd been an hour ago, sitting up slightly, which she'd told him to do and was going to address. And Ronan was standing near the window with his phone in his hand, not looking at it, holding it the way people hold objects when their hands need to be doing something, while their mind works somewhere else entirely. 40 minutes, she said. Ronan looked up, I heard. Then I need to know what the discharge plan looks like. Because right now your options are, he leaves this floor before the shift change. Or he's still here when the men outside this room, who are not your men, come back on rotation and find that his IV has been changed and someone has been in here who shouldn't be. He can't walk, one of Ronan's men said. His name, she'd gathered, was Cutter, not his real name. She was almost certain, but the one everyone used. He was built wide and kept his arms crossed in a way less aggressive than it was structural. Like he held himself together that way. He takes 2 steps and he's going down. I can walk, Dash said. You absolutely cannot, Audrey said, without turning around. I've walked with worse. That statement concerns me on multiple levels, but it's not the point. She turned to face him. He was sitting up at about a 40-degree angle, which was frankly more than she'd expected. But his color went a shade wrong every time he shifted his weight, and she could see the micro-expression of pain he was controlling very deliberately because he didn't want to do it in front of the room. You have an abdominal repair that is 4 days old and was undertreated for most of those 4 days. You are not walking out of here under your own power. That's not bravado versus cowardice, that's math. If you tear that repair, you are back to bleeding internally, and the nearest surgical team is whoever's on call at 2A. And I cannot help you with that. Dash looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Audrey. A wheelchair, Ronan said. From where? Cutter asked. From the hallway, Audrey said. There's one parked outside the rehabilitation suite on this floor. I saw it when I was at the supply cart. She paused. If someone can get to it without drawing attention, we have a viable exit. There's a service elevator at the east end of the corridor. It doesn't go through the main lobby. The room went quiet in a particular way, the quiet of people recalibrating around new information. Ronan looked at her with something she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was closer to the expression of someone who had made an assessment and was now adjusting the assessment upward. "You've been planning this," he said. "I've been being a nurse," Audrey said. "We know every exit. It's a survival skill." Getting Dash from the bed to the wheelchair took 11 minutes and was one of the uglier things Audrey had managed in a career that contained some genuinely ugly moments. Not because of the physical difficulty she'd transferred patients in worse condition with less help, but because Dash was 26 and proud in the way young men who have spent their lives proving something tend to be proud. And every time his body betrayed him, every wince, every catch of breath, every moment when his legs didn't cooperate the way he expected, she could see him processing it as a personal failure rather than a medical reality. "Stop fighting it," she said quietly, on his left side while Cutter took his right. "I'm not fighting anything. You're bracing against the pain instead of breathing through it. That's fighting it. You're making it worse." He exhaled through his nose. It was a controlled, deliberate exhale, the kind that came from practice. "There you go," she said. Ronan watched from near the door. He didn't offer to help, not because he was indifferent, but because he understood. She thought that help had to be the right kind. His presence was doing something else. It was keeping Dash's eyes focused on a fixed point, something to orient toward when his body was being uncooperative and his pride was filing complaints. When Dash was in the wheelchair, gray-faced and breathing carefully, and not looking at anyone for about 30 seconds, Ronan crouched down in front of him. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him, the kind of look that carried the weight of 4 days of searching, and whatever Dash had told him in that room while Audrey had been in the hallway counting minutes. Dash said quietly, "I know," Ronan said. He stood up. "Let's go," he said to Cutter. The service elevator was slow and smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and something underneath it that the industrial cleaning fluid hadn't quite covered. It fit the wheelchair, Cutter, Audrey, and Ronan, and nobody spoke during the descent because there was nothing to say that was worth the sound it would make in that enclosed metal box at 2 in the morning. In the basement, a black SUV was already waiting at the loading dock. Audrey stopped at the door. Ronan stopped beside her. "You should go home," he said. He said it without inflection, not warmly, not coldly, just as a factual statement about what the next appropriate thing was. "Where is he going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I can give you." Audrey looked at the SUV. At Cutter, carefully maneuvering the wheelchair over the threshold. At Dash's hand gripping the armrest with the specific tension of someone maintaining consciousness by sheer determination. "He needs the antibiotic I mentioned," she said. "He needs it within 6 hours, or the fever comes back and comes back worse. The wound site needs to be cleaned and redressed tomorrow. He needs someone monitoring his temperature every 4 hours for the next 48. If it goes above 102 again, that's not a situation for whatever you have available, that is a hospital situation. And you need to make that call, even if it's complicated." She was looking at Ronan. When she said all of it, he was listening in the focused, economical way he did everything, taking in information, without performing the act of receiving it. "I'll arrange what you described," he said, "with someone qualified." "Yes, I want to believe you." "I know," he said. "And then you have no reason to." "That's also true." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The loading dock was cold. Late October in Philadelphia was serious about it, and the light above the door was one of those yellow-orange security lights that made everyone look like they were standing in an old photograph. "Take care of him," she said. She went back inside. She did not sleep that night. She told herself she would take the train home at 3 a. Made tea she didn't drink, sat on the edge of her bed in the dark with her work shoes, still on for 20 minutes before she finally admitted that her brain had no intention of cooperating. She changed clothes, sat on the couch, watched the gray light build outside her window the way it built in November, reluctantly, like the day didn't want to commit. She thought about the IV, whether she'd gotten the rate right, whether the wound site was progressing toward infection or pulling back from it, splitting, whether the man she'd handed Dash's care to would actually follow through, or whether follow-through would turn out to mean something different in the world Ronan Whitlock operated in. She thought about that crouched-down moment. Ronan, in front of that wheelchair saying nothing, the whole weight of Ford's days visible in the line of his shoulders. She went to work at 7 and did not mention any of it to anyone. 3 weeks passed. She was good at compartmentalization. 6 years of critical care had required it. You could not carry every patient home with you and survive the work. You developed the ability to close a door in your mind, not because you didn't care, but because caring without limit was its own kind of damage. She closed the door on room 714, and Dashiell Merrick and the service elevator and the cold loading dock and Ronan Whitlock's unreadable dark eyes, and she went back to her regular life. She picked up a double shift on the cardiac floor. She rescheduled a dentist appointment she'd been avoiding for 4 months. She had dinner with her colleague Dana, who talked for 45 minutes about a situation with her landlord that Audrey listened to with genuine attention because it was uncomplicated and present and belonged entirely to the world she actually lived in. She was fine. She was mostly fine. On the 22nd day, she found the envelope. It was in her locker, not slipped under the door, not left on the shelf, but placed inside, which meant someone had gotten the combination or the key or both, and the calmness with which she processed that information was itself a little alarming. She stood in front of the open locker with her street shoes in one hand and stared at it. Plain white envelope, her first name on the front. Nothing else. Inside, a phone number, and below it, in handwriting that was economical and clear and utterly without embellishment. The monitor flagged again. Different floor. She stood there for a long time. The monitor flagged again. She understood it immediately, not as a threat, not as a warning in the conventional sense. As information, specific, pointed information, delivered to someone who would know what it meant. Another patient in this building, on a different floor, in circumstances that had flagged the same way, dashes had wrong name, wrong paperwork, wrong everything except the body in the bed, which was real and deteriorating, and not going to wait for the appropriate channels to notice. She called the number that night. He answered on the second ring. "How did you get into my locker?" she asked. "I didn't," Ronan said. "Someone I trust did. That's a distinction without a difference." "I know." She was in her kitchen, standing at the counter because she'd been too tense to sit down since she'd found the envelope and hadn't fully processed that tension yet. The overhead light was too bright, and her tea was cold, and she was holding the phone in a way that was going to make her hand cramp if she kept it up. "Who's on the other floor?" she asked. "A woman named Teresa Graves. 41. She works for a man who works for me. 2 nights ago, she was in a car accident that was not an accident. She's listed under a different name. Her actual family doesn't know where she is. Is she in danger? She's in a hospital bed. Whether she stays safe there," a pause. "I don't know who has access to her room. I don't know who's watching it. And you need someone to go look. I need someone to go look who looks like they belong there." Audrey breathed out slowly. "This is not a solution, what you're describing. You can't call me every time someone who works for you ends up in a hospital under a fake name. I know that. So what are you actually proposing?" A pause. Not a calculated one, she was getting better at reading his pauses, which was itself information about how much she'd been thinking about this conversation since the envelope. This pause was the kind where someone was deciding how much of what they'd already decided to say. "A coordinator," he said. "Someone who establishes actual medical infrastructure. Not underground, I don't want underground. I want legitimate care. A private clinic arrangement. Something that means the people under my protection don't end up in facilities with compromised treatment under names that aren't theirs." "You want a Mafia doctor," Audrey said. "No, that's what you're describing. I'm describing something different. I'm describing someone who builds a system where people get real care, who answers to medicine first and to me second, who has full authority inside any room where someone needs treatment." He paused again. "You told me in that elevator that you didn't like when someone in your ICU decided the paperwork mattered more than the patient. You told me the system failed, people who didn't fit neatly into it." She hadn't said any of that, she realized slowly. Not explicitly. Not in words. Which meant he'd extrapolated it. From the way she'd talked. From the things she'd implied. He'd been paying attention, in the way people paid attention when they were trying to understand someone rather than just hear them. That was more unsettling than the envelope. What I told you, she said carefully, was that his IV was wrong and his fever was climbing. I don't remember the rest of that conversation being a job interview. It wasn't, Ronan said. That's why it was useful. She put her cold tea in the sink. She needed something to do with her hands. I have conditions, she said. Non-negotiable ones. The silence on the other end had a specific quality, not agreement, but the readiness to hear. I will never participate in anything that causes harm. Not directly, not indirectly, not by looking the other way. If I treat someone, I treat them as a patient. Their history with you, their role in whatever operation they're part of, that's irrelevant to me. What's relevant is their condition and what they need. Agreed. If I see evidence of abuse of anyone, in any circumstance I report it. Full stop. You don't get a say in that. A shorter pause this time. Agreed. And inside any room where someone needs medical care. You outrank me, Ronan said. He said it without hesitation, without resentment, without any of the performance of a man conceding something he resented conceding. He said it like a practical arrangement between two people who had both decided what they valued. I understood that in room 714. It's not a condition I have difficulty accepting. Audrey was quiet for a moment. There's a woman named Teresa Graves on another floor of my hospital, she said finally. She needs someone to assess her actual condition, verify her treatment, and make sure nobody has interfered with her care. Yes, Ron said. I'll go tonight. Teresa Graves was on the 3rd floor, listed under the name Carla Simmons, and she was in considerably better shape than Dash had been. A concussion, 2 cracked ribs, a laceration on her forearm that had been partly closed. Her chart was a mess of inconsistencies, but her actual medical treatment was adequate. She was conscious and frightened and had been telling the nurses her name was Carla Simmons for 2 days because she was afraid of what happened if she stopped. Audrey sat with her for 40 minutes. She didn't explain who she was or how she'd found her. She just sat and listened, and when Teresa said quietly that she didn't know who to trust in this building, Audrey told her that she was a nurse, and her job was Teresa's health and nothing else, and that she was going to make sure Teresa's family knew she was safe. Teresa started crying, quietly, into the thin pillow, with the practiced restraint of someone who had been holding it for 2 days and had made a decision not to come apart completely, because coming apart completely felt dangerous. Audrey stayed until she stopped. Over the following months, she found her footing in something she didn't have a name for. It wasn't being a Mafia doctor. It wasn't what she'd pictured when she'd first heard Ronan's voice on the phone at her kitchen counter. It was more like infrastructure. Building the kind of care that should have existed anyway, for people who kept falling through gaps that no one had bothered to fill. She established a relationship with a private clinic on the edge of Center City, a legitimate one, with actual licenses and actual staff. She built protocols. She trained 2 nurses she trusted with selective information and a full explanation of patient confidentiality. She set up a system where someone under Ronan's umbrella who needed medical care could get it without the kind of institutional jeopardy that came from checking in under a false name. She saw Ronan twice a month, on average. The meetings were practical at first: logistics, arrangements, specific cases. He was a precise communicator. He didn't waste words and he didn't perform warmth he didn't feel, which she respected more than she expected to. He listened the way people listened when they were actually planning to use the information rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. She noticed after a while that she was leaving the meetings later than she'd intended. She noticed after a while longer that she was thinking about specific things he'd said in the days after they'd said them. She told herself this was professional investment. She was good at telling herself useful things. What she was less good at was ignoring Dash. Dash had recovered fully. Apparently, he walked into the clinic for a follow-up 6 weeks after 714 with the self-conscious ease of someone who'd been told they were supposed to take it slow and had taken it slow for about 4 days before deciding they'd recovered sufficiently. He was taller than she'd registered in that bed, younger, looking healthy than he'd looked sick. He looked at the clinic the way people looked at things they hadn't expected. Nice, he said. Thank you, Audrey said. Ronan funded this? Partially. I applied for 2 grants and arm-twisted a pharmaceutical rep into a supply donation. Dash looked at her with something that was trying hard not to be a grin and failing. Did the arm twisting involve actual arms? Aggressively pointed questions about billing transparency, Audrey said. It has the same effect. He sat down for the checkup with considerably less resistance than she'd expected, which told her something about the last 6 weeks. He let her check the wound site healed, clean, a flat scar that would fade, and his blood pressure and his temperature without making it into a performance of indifference. When she was done, he sat with his shirt back on, looking at the middle distance, with an expression that had shifted into something more careful. The person who arranged what happened to me, he said. It wasn't a question. Ronan told me there was a traitor, Audrey said. She kept her voice even. He didn't tell me who. That's because he's been careful about who knows. Dash looked at her directly. Blaine Carradine, his strategist. The man's been with him for 7 years. Knows everything, every operation, every contact, every person Ronan considers. He stopped. Every vulnerability. The word sat in the room. Why are you telling me? Audrey asked. Because you need to know, Dash said. Not for strategy. Not because you're part of this. He paused. Because Ronan isn't going to tell you, and he should. And the reason he won't is the same reason this matters more than he's letting on. She waited. Blaine knows about you, Dash said. He's been watching the arrangement since it started. He knows your name, your clinic, your schedule. A beat. He knows what you mean to Ronan. The room was very quiet. What do I mean to Ronan? Audrey asked. Dash looked at her steadily. You know the answer to that. She did know. She'd known for a while, in the way you knew things you weren't ready to act on at a distance, as a fact about the landscape rather than something requiring a response. She'd been careful about it. Careful in the specific way of someone who understood that feelings that lived in complicated situations tended to make those situations more complicated, and the situation was already complicated enough. If Blaine knows, she started. Then you're not just a coordinator anymore, Dash said. You're a target, not because of anything you've done, because of what it would do to him. She exhaled slowly. Does Ronan know that Blaine knows about me? Not yet. You need to tell him. I'm going to, Dash said. Tonight. I wanted to tell you first. Why he was quiet for a moment. Because you should get to decide what you do with the information before he does. He's going to want to manage it. That's what he does. He manages things to protect people. And sometimes the managing is its own problem. Audrey looked at him across the small exam room. The fluorescent light above buzzed slightly at its edges. Outside, the city went about its business in the particular late afternoon register of a Thursday buses, voices, someone's music bleeding through a cracked window somewhere nearby. What are you recommending? She asked. I'm not recommending anything, Dash said. I just think you should know before the decision gets made for you. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Seat C. She thought about it while she closed the clinic for the evening, while she walked to the train, while she stood on the platform watching the headlights appear in the tunnel dark. She called Ronan before she'd made a decision. He answered before the second ring, the way he always did, like he'd been holding the phone, waiting, which she knew wasn't true and which felt true anyway. Dash came in today, she said. I know. He told me he was going. He told me about Blaine Carradine. The silence had weight. He shouldn't have. He was right to, Audrey said. Don't be angry with him. I'm not angry. He said it flatly, and it was true. She thought the flatness wasn't suppressed anger. It was suppressed something else. Concern, maybe. Or the particular dread of someone who has been carefully keeping a wall between two parts of their life, and has just heard the wall described out loud by someone who walked through it. Blaine knows about me, she said. Yes. How long have you known that he knows? A pause. Longer than it should have been. Ronan. 3 weeks, he said. She stood on the train platform with the November air cutting through her jacket and the headlights growing in the tunnel and the specific cold clarity of a person who has just been told something by the shape of an omission rather than the content of a disclosure. You've known for 3 weeks, she said, that I was in danger. And you didn't tell me. I was managing it. You were managing me. I was managing the situation. There is no difference between those two things. From where I'm standing, her voice was level. She was good at level. She'd learned level in the ICU, when level was the only register that kept a patient from panicking while their body was doing something catastrophic. You made a decision about what I should know and when I should know it. Without asking me, without consulting me, you decided I couldn't handle it. That's not why. Then tell me why. The train arrived. She didn't get on. She stood there while the doors opened, and the people moved around her, and the doors closed and the train left, and she held the phone against her ear and waited. Because once I told you, Ronan said, it became real in a way I couldn't contain. And I couldn't protect you from something real, the way I could protect you from something I was still managing. A pause. That's not a justification. That's an explanation. She registered the distinction. He always made that distinction. Explanation versus justification. She'd noticed it before. It was the habit of someone who had spent a long time being precise about accountability. Blaine isn't just a traitor, she said, slowly, working through it out loud in the way she worked through complex patient presentations, not thinking in silence, but using the act of speaking to clarify. He partnered with a rival. Dash was bait. You were the target all along. Yes. And now that Dash is recovered, and the arrangement with me is established, and Blaine can see that you have something you didn't have a year ago, she stopped. He'll move, Ronan said quietly. Soon. The next platform announcement echoed through the station. Cold tile, cold air, the fluorescent lights, humming at the same register as the ones in her clinic and every hospital she'd ever worked in. That specific frequency that lived just below the level of conscious attention and vibrated there constantly until you forgot it was there. I need you to promise me something, Audrey said. Tell me what it is first. When this happens, when Blaine moves, you tell me. You don't manage it. You don't contain it. You tell me what's happening in real time. A long pause. I need your word, she said, the same way I needed it in that elevator. In that elevator, Ronan said carefully, you were the one setting conditions. I'm still the one setting conditions, Audrey said. That hasn't changed. Another pause. She could hear him breathing slow, measured the controlled respiration of someone who was feeling something strongly and had extensive practice not letting it show. You have my word, he said. She finally moved toward the next train. She believed him. She also understood in the part of her that had spent 6 years watching people make promises in hospitals, promises to themselves, to patients, to the versions of outcomes they needed to believe in, that a promise made in good faith and kept under pressure were two different things, and the distance between them was exactly the size of whatever Blaine Carradine was planning. She got on the train. The doors closed behind her. And 3 weeks later, the emergency call came a man seriously injured, a private clinic on the industrial edge of the city. Her presence needed immediately, and she went, because she had always run toward the emergency. A sound and splitting, and because Ronan had given her his word, and because she had not yet learned the specific lesson that the most dangerous traps were the ones that looked exactly like the thing you were already trained to run toward. The call came at 11:22 p.m. on a Wednesday. Audrey was already in bed, not asleep, but horizontal, which was the closest she'd managed in the last 3 days. She'd been running the clinic 6 days a week since October, covering shifts at Blackridge on the 7th, and her body had started communicating its dissatisfaction through methods she was professionally qualified to recognize and personally inclined to ignore. Tension headaches behind her right eye, a tightness in her upper back that had graduated from inconvenient to constant. The particular kind of exhaustion that didn't resolve with sleep because it wasn't physical. It was the kind that came from operating at sustained alertness, from being the person in every room who was watching everything. Her phone lit up on the nightstand. Unknown number. But the clinic's forwarding system routed through 3 different numbers, depending on the hour, and she'd stopped keeping track of which one was active when. She answered. This is Audrey Bellamy. The voice on the other end was male. Not a voice she recognized. Tense in the specific way of someone delivering information they'd been told to deliver quickly. We need you at the Carver Street location. One of Mr. Whitlock's men, serious injury, possible internal bleeding. He's been asking for you specifically. She was already sitting up. What happened? Vehicle incident. He's stable but deteriorating. We can't move him far. Who is this? My name doesn't matter. Mr. Whitlock authorized this call. She looked at the time. 11:22. She thought about Ronan's voice, 3 weeks ago, and the train doors closing, and the part of her that had understood even then that a promise and a promise kept were two different distances. Give me the address, she said. The Carver Street location was a private medical facility. She'd never used not one of her established sites, not one of the 3 clinics she'd built relationships with over the past months. When she typed the address into her phone, it came up as a converted industrial building on the southwestern edge of the city, in the kind of neighborhood that was between development and neglect, between functional and abandoned. The streets wide and mostly empty at this hour, and the buildings large and without personality. She noticed pulling up in the car she'd called that the lights inside were low. She noticed that there were no other vehicles. She'd expect no ambulance, no second car, nothing that looked like a rushed response to a medical emergency. Just a black sedan parked at an angle near the entrance, like it had arrived fast and stopped without caring about the parking space. She noticed all of this. She got out anyway, because she was a nurse. Because someone had said internal bleeding and deteriorating, and her brain had already committed to the trajectory of a patient who needed her, and the part of her that assessed risk was running slightly behind the part of her that moved toward emergencies. She would think about that order of operations later. She would think about it many times. The door to the building was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped into a corridor that was too quiet, not the quiet of a late-night medical facility, which had its own sounds, its own machinery, its own particular frequency of ongoing care. This was a different quiet, held quiet, the quiet of a space where people were waiting. She had walked 6 steps down the corridor when she understood. There was no patient. The room at the end of the corridor had been set up to look functional, a cot against one wall, a standing lamp, a folding table, with medical supplies arranged on it, with the self-conscious precision of someone who had been told what a medical setup looked like, but had never actually worked in one. The IV stand had no bag on it. The supplies on the table were still in their packaging. The cot had no sheets. Blaine Carradine was standing near the window. He was 53, and he looked like a man who had spent 53 years being the smartest person in any room and had let that accumulate into a posture. Medium height, lean, with the groomed neatness of someone who managed his appearance as a professional asset. His suit was charcoal, not the same shade as Ronan's, she thought irrelevantly, a little lighter, the color of someone who wanted to be mistaken for authority rather than someone who actually had it. He looked at her the way people looked at something they'd been waiting to obtain. "Ms. Bellamy," he said, "thank you for coming." She looked at the room, at the 2 men positioned near the only door, at the window behind Blaine, which was dark and faced the back of another building, at the table with its staged, untouched medical supplies. "There's no patient," she said. "No," Blaine said. "There isn't." She looked at him directly. Her heart was doing something loud and irregular, but her voice was level because she had trained it to be level in situations that required it, and this was going to require it. "What do you want?" "To talk," he said. "Just that. A conversation. People who want conversations don't manufacture medical emergencies to get them. People who want conversations with someone protected by Ronan Whitlock sometimes don't have many other options." He gestured toward a folding chair near the table with the easy familiarity of a man comfortable directing people in spaces he controlled. "Sit down." She didn't sit down. Blaine registered this without visible reaction. He moved to the folding table himself and stood beside it, hands resting lightly on the surface, the posture of someone settling in. "You've been running his medical operation for 7 months, he said. "You've built real infrastructure, I'll give you credit for that. Legitimate clinics, actual staff, grant funding. It's impressive. Why are you telling me things you clearly already know?" "Because I want you to understand that I've been watching it carefully." He paused. "And I want you to understand what you've actually built, not what you think you've built." Something in his tone had shifted, not threatening, which she'd been braced for. more pedagogical, the tone of a man who believed he was about to correct a misunderstanding. "You think you've built a medical service," Blaine said. "What you've actually built is the most sophisticated cover operation Ronan has run in 15 years. The foundation, the grant applications, the pharmaceutical relationships, it's all clean, all documentable, all completely real, which makes it perfect. You've given him a legitimate face that is actually legitimate, which is considerably harder to dismantle than a fake one." He looked at her steadily. "You've also given him something he has never had before, which is a reason to care whether tomorrow happens." She heard the last sentence with the specific attention of someone identifying the real content of a communication buried beneath several layers of other communication. "You're not here to talk to me," she said slowly. "You're here to use me." "I'm here to offer you a choice," Blaine said, "which is more than Ronan offered you when he brought you into this. He gave you conditions and a handshake and let you build something without explaining what it would eventually be used for. I'm being more direct. What do you want from me?" Blaine turned to the folding table and picked up a single sheet of paper. He held it toward her, not handing it over, just displaying it. From where she stood, she could see it was a document. Dense text, official formatting. "I need Ronan to sign a transfer agreement," he said. "Operational control of 4 specific logistics companies. The real ones, not the legitimate fronts, the actual operations underneath them. He signs, everything stays quiet. The medical foundation continues." You continue. A pause. "Everyone currently under his protection continues." Audrey looked at the paper, then at Blaine, then at the 2 men near the door. "And if he doesn't sign," she said. Blaine set the paper back down with a small, neat gesture. "Then I have a conversation with a federal contact of mine about certain activities connected to the Bellamy Night Care Foundation. Specifically about who funds it, who it treats, and what some of those patients have in common." He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Your name is on every document, Ms. Bellamy. The grants, the leases, the pharmaceutical agreements. You signed all of it, which means when someone starts asking questions about what the foundation is really for." "It's a medical clinic," Audrey said. "That's exactly what it is. I built it to be exactly what it looks like." "I know," Blaine said. "That's what makes it useful to destroy." The room was cold. She'd noticed it when she walked in a chill that the standing lamp wasn't touching the industrial building, holding the November temperature without resistance. She could feel it now in her hands, which were very still at her sides. She thought about Dana, her colleague from Blackridge, who had no idea any of this existed. She thought about the 2 nurses she'd hired, who believed they were working for a legitimate after-hours care operation. She thought about Teresa Graves, who had cried quietly into a pillow on a hospital floor because she was afraid, and who had been able to stop being afraid because Audrey had built something that made stopping possible. "You want me to convince him to sign," she said. "I want you to call him," Blaine said. "Right now. From this room, and explain to him that you're here, and what the situation is, and what I need him to do. He'll make the right decision. Because of me," she said. She said it flatly. Not a question. "Because of you," Blaine confirmed. And the way he said it, without cruelty, without even particular satisfaction, just as a practical statement of leverage, was somehow worse than if he'd been enjoying it. She looked at the phone in her hand. She called Ronan. He answered before the second ring, the way he always did. She knew immediately from the half-second pause, after she said his name, that he was reading something in the quality of her voice before she'd said anything else. "Where are you?" he said. "Carver Street, a building at the southwest corner of the industrial block off Palmer." She kept her voice completely neutral. Clinical, the voice she used in trauma bays, when she needed the room to stay calm and was starting with herself. "Blaine Carradine is here. He has 2 men with him. I'm not hurt." The silence on his end lasted less than 3 seconds. "Stay on the line. He wants you to sign a transfer agreement. 4 logistics operations. He's threatening to connect the foundation to federal inquiries if you don't." She paused. "He's using me to get to you. I want you to know that I understand that. I want you to make whatever decision you would make if I weren't in this room." "Audrey, I mean it," she said. "Don't let this change the calculation." Blaine was watching her from across the room. His expression hadn't changed. He was listening, evaluating, running his own calculation about what her tone meant and what Ronan's response would be. Ronan said very quietly, "I'm coming." "I know," she said. "I'm buying time until you do." She lowered the phone but didn't end the call. She put it in her jacket pocket with the lines open and looked at Blaine. "He's thinking about it," she said. Blaine looked at her for a moment with something that revised slightly upward, not respect, but the adjacent thing, the acknowledgement that he'd miscalculated something about her. "Sit down," he said again. This time she did. Not because he'd told her to. Because she needed to think, and thinking required the appearance of compliance right now, and she was doing something she hadn't told anyone she was doing. She was looking at the room. The emergency panel was on the wall near the corridor entrance. She'd seen it when she walked in, a standard industrial fire safety box, the kind required by code in any building above a certain square footage. It was old. The indicator light on the panel was green, which meant active, which meant the system was connected. The alarm pole was on the panel. Between her and the panel were 6 feet of open corridor, one of Blaine's men, and the reasonable likelihood that moving toward the door would be interpreted as an escape attempt rather than what it actually was. She looked at the two men, their positioning, how often they moved their weight. A sound haunted the room continuously, or had the slight gap in attention that everyone developed when they'd been standing still for more than 20 minutes and nothing had happened. The one nearest the door shifted his weight to his left foot. He'd been doing it every 4 to 5 minutes. She'd clocked it 3 times. She looked at the medical supply table. The supplies were in their packaging, but packaging was useful. She could see 2 rolls of medical tape, a sealed pack of gauze, 3 individually wrapped alcohol swabs, and a sealed suture kit that she had absolutely no use for right now, but whose rigid plastic packaging, thrown with sufficient force, would make enough noise to min it. She stopped that line of thinking and started it again more carefully. What she needed was not an escape. She wasn't going to outrun 2 men who were larger than her and positioned between her and the only exit. What she needed was chaos. Enough chaos to change the geometry of the room, to create a window of seconds that could be used for something specific. The alarm pole was on the panel. The panel was 6 feet from the corridor entrance. If the alarm sounded, this building, whatever it was, industrial, converted, partially operational, would trigger an automated response. Not police, not necessarily. Fire department. Building security, if any remained active. People, outside presence. A reason for Blaine's men to reassess the tactical situation of staying in this room. She needed 4 seconds, maybe 5. She needed the man nearest the door to be looking somewhere else. She reached into the supply table and picked up the sealed suture kit. She held it in her hand and looked at it with the focused professional attention of someone examining a piece of medical equipment, and she waited. Blaine was watching her, but Blaine was also checking his phone. She'd seen him do it twice, looking at the screen, putting it face down on the table, looking again. He was waiting for something. A confirmation, maybe. A message from whoever he had positioned outside. His eyes dropped to the phone. The man at the door shifted his weight to his left. Audrey stood up, and in the same motion she threw the suture kit toward the far corner of the room, not at anyone, just into the corner, hard enough that it hit the concrete wall with a crack that was louder than it had any right to be in the enclosed space, and she was already moving before it landed. She had 4 steps to the door. She took them. The man at the door was faster than she'd budgeted for, and his hand caught her left arm at the elbow before she'd reached the corridor, spinning her back and off balance, and she went into the wall with her shoulder, hard enough to send a bolt of pain through her collarbone that she filed away for later. But her right hand had already hit the alarm pole. The sound was enormous. Industrial fire alarms in converted buildings were a specific category of terrible, not the measured electronic tone of a hospital system designed to alert without panicking, but the full-throated, mechanical screaming of old infrastructure responding to a simple electrical command with maximum output. Every overhead light in the building switched to emergency red. The sound was physical, something you felt in the back of your teeth. The man holding her arm let go, not a decision reflex. The alarm had changed the room, and the reflex responded before the decision could. Audrey hit the floor in the corridor and pushed herself upright against the wall and did not run toward the exit, because running toward the exit was what they'd expect, and the two men were already moving to cover it. Instead, she moved left deeper into the corridor, away from the entrance, toward the interior of the building, where the alarm had tripped a secondary set of emergency lights, and the hallway opened into what looked like a larger industrial space. She heard Blaine's voice behind her, cutting through the alarm with the specific volume of someone accustomed to being heard. Don't let her. She was already through the second door. The space on the other side was large, a former warehouse floor, mostly empty, with the high ceiling and the concrete columns of industrial construction, and the specific cold of a space that wasn't heated, just enclosed. Emergency lighting turned everything arterial and strange. She moved toward the far wall, not because she knew where it led, but because the far wall was away from the door she'd come through. She found a staircase. She went up. The second floor was a series of former offices glass-walled, most of the glass removed, the frames standing empty. She moved through them without breaking stride, and found a window on the east side of the building that faced a narrow alley, and beyond the alley, the street. She could hear footsteps on the staircase, one set, heavy and fast. She looked at the window. It was 10 feet above the alley floor. Not impossible. She'd done worse in practical terms. She had also taken a hit to her shoulder that was going to complicate the landing. She was doing the calculation when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. "Ronan," she answered without stopping moving. "Eastside," she said. "Second floor. There's an alley. I see the building. I'm at the north entrance." A pause. "Get to the ground floor. Cutter is in the alley." "There's someone behind me." "I know, 30 seconds. She trusted that. She trusted it with the specific, rooted certainty of someone who had watched this man make promises, and she turned away from the window and moved back through the empty office frames toward the staircase. And the man coming up it was right there at the top of the stairs, and she had no time and nowhere to go, and she did the only thing that was left. She stopped. She stood in the middle of the empty office floor in the red emergency light and faced the man coming up the stairs and held herself completely still and looked at him, the way she looked at situations she had already calculated and could not change. Level, awake, with the particular quality of stillness that wasn't submission, it was assessment. Waiting. He was one of Blaine's men, the one who hadn't been at the door, which meant he'd come from a different position, which meant there was a third person she hadn't accounted for. He was large, and he was breathing hard from the stairs, and his face in the red light was doing the thing faces did when authority had just been made to look incompetent, which was considerably more dangerous than planned hostility. He crossed the office floor and grabbed her arm again, the same arm, the left one, and pulled her toward the stairs. And she did not fight it, because fighting it would be losing, and she needed to not lose right now. She needed to be present and whole for what was coming next. Downstairs, Blaine was waiting. His composure had been affected. Not shattered, he was not the type for shattered, but the edges of it were different now. Had stopped when the building systems reset, but the emergency lights were still cycling, and in that pulsing red rhythm his face was showing something it hadn't shown before. "That was unnecessary," he said. "You lied to me about a patient," Audrey said. Her shoulder was genuinely bad now, and she was not going to let it show. Everything after that is proportionate response. "Sit down." The man behind her pushed her into the chair. She sat. She breathed. She was running the math on Ronan's 30 seconds and how long it had been, and what 30 seconds meant in a situation where the building perimeter was probably all ready. The north entrance exploded inward, not literally. But the door hit the interior wall with the sound of metal meeting concrete at significant velocity, and then there were footsteps, multiple, fast, coordinated, and Cutter came through the corridor door, first with his jacket open, and his expression carrying the compressed, forward-leaning energy of someone who had been given permission to stop being patient. Ronan came through 10 seconds later. He looked at the room the way he'd looked at Audrey in the elevator on that first night, with complete, rapid inventory. He took in Blaine. The two men, Audrey in the chair, the supply table, the staged cot, the document on the folding table. He took it all in approximately 2 seconds, and then his eyes found Audrey, and he looked at her with an attention that stripped everything else out of the room. "You're hurt," he said. "My shoulder. It's manageable." His jaw moved. He looked back at Blaine. Blaine, to his considerable credit, had not retreated. He was standing where he'd been standing, with his hands resting on the folding table and his posture assembled around the idea that this was still a negotiation rather than what it actually was. "Ronan," he said, "this doesn't have to be complicated." "You put your hands on her," Ronan said. "I needed." "You put your hands on her," Ronan said again, in exactly the same tone. Not louder, not harder, just repeated, with the specific emphasis of a man establishing a fact that was going to function as the premise for everything that followed. The room understood the emphasis. Blaine's two men were looking at the four men Ronan had brought with a recalculation happening visibly behind their eyes. Cutter was watching Blaine with an expression like a door that had been closed for some time and was considering being opened. "The transfer documents," Blaine said. "We can resolve this cleanly. You sign, I walk. The foundation continues." "The foundation is hers," Ronan said. "It was never mine to sign over anything connected to." Something shifted in Blaine's face. A miscalculation surfacing. "The federal exposure." "There is no federal exposure," Dash said. Audrey turned. Dash was in the doorway. She hadn't seen the south entrance, which she hadn't known existed. He was in a jacket, and he looked like he'd been outside in the cold, and he was carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder, and he was looking at Blaine with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the dry, near-grinning thing he defaulted to. Something older and considerably less forgiving. "We've had Blaine's communication with Sterling Vane documented for 11 weeks, Dash said. "Financial transfers, operational directives, the arrangement to use me as bait." He set the laptop bag on the floor with a precise, deliberate motion. "There's also everything you sent to your federal contact about the foundation, which means we know who your contact is, what you told them, and that the information you gave them was selectively framed to create a false investigative premise." He looked at Blaine directly. "Which is its own federal problem." Blaine's composure did something she'd never seen composure do in real time. It didn't break. It recalibrated, and the recalibration was visible. The posture adjusting around a new internal reality, the way a structure adjusts when one load-bearing element has been removed and the others have to take the weight. He looked at Ronan. "You knew," Blaine said. "You knew about the documentation." "For 3 months," Ronan said. "Then why?" "Because I wanted to know how far you'd go," Ronan said. "And now I know." The silence was total. Blaine looked at the room. At his men who were looking at the floor. At Cutter, who was not looking at the floor. At Dash, who was watching him with the specific quality of attention of someone who has been in a bed for 4 days because of you and has been waiting a long time for this particular moment without letting himself need it too much. Then Blaine looked at Audrey, and she understood. In that look, something she hadn't understood before. He hadn't just used her as leverage. He'd studied her. He'd watched 7 months of her work with the focused attention of an analyst, and what he'd found was not the weakness he'd expected, a woman in over her head, a civilian who could be frightened into cooperation. He'd found something he hadn't prepared for, a person who had walked into an impossible room voluntarily, repeatedly, because the room contained someone who needed help, a sound like green, and who had built something real in the middle of a world that was accustomed to building things that looked real. She had been his miscalculation. He'd thought she was Ronan's vulnerability. She'd turned out to be something else entirely. "What happens now?" Blaine asked. He was not asking Ronan. He was asking the room. Dash said quietly, "Now we make some calls." They stayed in the building for another 2 hours. Audrey sat in the folding chair and let Cutter look at her shoulder. He had more field medical experience than his job title suggested, which she filed away without comment, and she watched Ronan manage the room with the methodical precision of someone dismantling a structure they'd spent 11 weeks preparing to dismantle. Blaine's men were not hurt. They were contained, separated, and spoken to in the specific register that communicated to them clearly that the available choices had considerably, and the most functional one involved cooperation. Blaine himself sat in the corner on the cot with no sheets and said nothing for the better part of an hour. Ronan did not look at him often. When he did, it was brief, and carrying something she couldn't quite categorize, not hatred, which she would have expected. Something more like grief, which she hadn't. 7 years of proximity to someone turned out to be its own investment, even when the person had spent the last portion of it working to destroy you. Around 2 a.m., she found Ronan standing alone near the window on the south wall, looking out at the alley. She stood beside him. He didn't speak for a while. She didn't either. "I should have told you 3 weeks ago," he finally said. "Yes," she said. "I thought I could resolve it before it reached you." "I know you thought that," he looked at her. In the flat, settling light of the room, the emergency cycle had finally stopped. Just the regular industrial overheads now. He looked like what he was. A man who had been holding a great deal together for a very long time and was standing in the aftermath of the moment when holding it together had not been enough. "Your shoulder," he said. "Cutter says it's a bad bruise." "Not structural." She paused. "He's surprisingly competent." "He was a paramedic," Ronan said before. She absorbed that. The before was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and she let it do its work without pulling on it. "The federal contact Blaine has," she said. "Dash said the information was selectively framed. Does that mean it means received? A set of facts were designed to create a specific impression," Ronan said. "Those facts are real. The impression is false. Correcting the impression is going to require a more complicated conversation. With a federal investigator, yes." She looked at the alley outside. Cold concrete, a single overhead light, the particular urban emptiness of 2A. In a neighborhood that had never quite decided what it was. "This is the part," she said slowly, "where what you've been building and what I've been building become officially the same thing in the eyes of people who are now looking." Ronan was quiet. "The foundation has to be fully separated," she said. "Documented separation, independent board, independent auditing, financial disclosure that is complete and unambiguous. It cannot have any connection to your operations, not even the legitimate ones, not even through 3 removes." She paused. "If it doesn't have that, they'll use it. Not Blaine, someone else. The next Blaine, whoever comes after this." "I know," Ronan said. "It means stepping back," she said. "From the funding, from the involvement, even the involvement that was genuinely good." "I know," he said again. He said it the way he said things he'd already processed and arrived at and was not going to fight. It was always going to be yours. That was always the honest version of what it should be. She looked at him. He looked back at her. And in his face was the thing that had been building there for 7 months through practical meetings and late phone calls, and the accumulated specific weight of 2 people being in the same rooms for reasons that started as professional and had become, without announcement, something else, something that had no clean category and therefore no clean management, and was therefore, for a man who managed everything, both the most important thing he had and the most terrifying. "You didn't make the decision you would have made if I wasn't in this room," she said. "No," he said. "You came for me instead of waiting."
"Yes."
Which was what Blaine was counting on.
"Yes."
She held that. "Does that bother you?" Ronan looked at the alley for a long time. "The fact that he was right about what I'd do," said finally, "doesn't bother me. What I'd do is what I'd do." He paused. "What bothers me is that I gave him the information he needed to know what I'd do. That I was visible in a way I've spent 15 years not being visible. And the reason I was visible," he stopped, "is me," she said. "Is what matters to me," he said, which is a different statement. She was quiet for a moment. "Blaine said I gave you something you didn't have before," she said. "A reason to care whether tomorrow happened." Ronan said nothing. "Is that true?" A long pause, longer than most of his. "That's an understatement," he said. The window showed her the alley, the cold, the single light, the dark beyond it. Behind her, she could hear Dash talking quietly, the sounds of the room settling toward resolution, the doing what buildings did when the crisis inside them was over, and the structure still stood. She thought about 7 months of building something real. She thought about the foundation and Teresa Graves and the 2 nurses she'd hired and the grants she'd written at her kitchen table at midnight and the pharmaceutical rep she'd argued into a supply donation. She thought about what it would mean, going forward, to build it without the complication of Ronan Whitlock's Ronan's world surrounding it. She thought about what it would mean to build anything at all without him somewhere in the same room. And she understood, standing at that window at 2 in the morning, with a bruised shoulder and cold hands, and 11 weeks of danger she hadn't fully known she was standing in. That the decision she'd been postponing for 7 months, treating it as a landscape feature rather than a choice that required a response, was no longer postponable. Everything that came next was going to require her to know exactly where she stood. She turned away from the window. "Tell me what the conversation with the federal investigator looks like," she said. "I need to understand every piece of it before we start making calls." Ronan looked at her. Something in his face, the controlled, working, carefully maintained surface of it, shifted in the way it shifted when she had said something that clarified a situation he'd been trying to see clearly. "Dash," he said, without looking away from her. "From across the room, yeah. Bring the documentation." "Already walking," Dash said. And they got to work. The federal conversation took 4 days. Not 4 days of continuous talking, 4 days of the specific, grinding, start-and-stop rhythm of people assembling a complicated truth in front of someone whose job was to find the holes in it. The investigator's name was Carla Mendez. She was 44 DOJ, and she had the quality Audrey had encountered in the best attending physicians she'd worked under: the ability to listen to something completely, without any of the listening showing on her face. She met with Audrey first, alone, without Ronan, without Dash, without anyone from that world in the room. Just Audrey and Mendez and a conference table in a downtown office building that smelled like old carpet and recent coffee, and the particular staleness of a space where difficult conversations happened regularly. Mendez put a folder on the table and didn't open it. "Tell me about the Bellamy Night Care Foundation," she said. So Audrey told her everything. Not the version that omitted things, the real version. From the elevator at Blackridge to the clinic on Carver Street, from the IV line she'd corrected at 1A, M to the grant applications she'd written at her kitchen table. She told it plainly, in the order it happened, without softening the parts that complicated her, and without dramatizing the parts that were already dramatic enough. Mendez listened for 2 hours without interrupting. At the end, she opened the folder. Inside was a photograph, the Foundation's first clinic, taken from the outside, probably from a surveillance file. Clean storefront. The painted sign Audrey had commissioned from a local artist. The hours listed on the door. Blaine Carradine told us this facility was being used as a coordination point for criminal logistics operations, Mendez said. Blaine Carradine used it as a threat, Audrey said. There's a difference between a claim someone makes to a federal investigator and a claim that's true. We're in the business of determining that difference. Then determine it, Audrey said. Come to the clinic. Review the patient records properly anonymized. I'll walk you through the privacy framework myself. Talk to the pharmaceutical suppliers, the grant organizations, the community health board that did our initial certification. Talk to the patients if they consent. She paused. What you'll find is a medical operation that is exactly what it looks like, which is apparently more unusual than it should be. Mendez looked at her for a long moment, and Ronan Whitlock provided partial initial funding, which I have documented, which is also documented as having been formally terminated and replaced with independent grant funding as of 8 weeks ago. She'd done that paperwork herself at the kitchen table 2 weeks after the conversation at Ronan's window about what separation needed to look like. She'd done it before it was legally necessary, because it was the right structure, and she'd known which was the right structure for longer than she'd been willing to act on it. You anticipated this investigation, Mendez said. I anticipated that someone might try to use the foundation against Ronan, Audrey said. I protected it accordingly. Mendez closed the folder. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, the documentation Dashiell Merrick provided us about Carradine and Sterling Vane, you were aware of it? I was aware it existed. I wasn't involved in assembling it. Do you know how it was assembled? I know Dash spent 11 weeks being meticulous about it, Audrey said. I know it's complete. I know that if you look at it carefully, the federal exposure Blaine used turns out to be the kind that points back at him. She paused. But you already know that. That's why I'm in this room, instead of somewhere considerably less comfortable. Mendez almost smiled. Almost, you're direct. I'm a nurse, Audrey said. I don't have time not to be. The second meeting was 3 days later and included Ronan. That one Audrey didn't attend. She'd been explicit about that. The Foundation's relationship with the investigation needed to be demonstrably independent of his, and demonstrably independent meant she wasn't in the room when he sat across from Mendez and answered for the parts of his history that were his to answer for. She waited in the lobby of the building for 3 hours. Dash sat beside her for the first hour, drinking terrible vending machine coffee and not talking much, which was the kind of company she'd come to appreciate about him. He's going to be fine, Dash said at some point in the second hour. I know, Audrey said. He's done this before. Not exactly this. But versions of this. I know that too. A pause. You're not worried about the meeting, Dash said. No. What are you worried about? She looked at the lobby ceiling. Generic commercial space, the kind that existed in thousands of office buildings in thousands of American cities, interchangeable and impersonal and oddly stabilizing for it. What comes after, she said. Dash nodded slowly. He understood what she meant. She thought he was perceptive, in the way people were perceptive when they'd spent a long time watching someone they cared about navigate something complicated. And he'd been watching Ronan navigate her for the better part of a year. He's been thinking about after, for a while, Dash said. She didn't ask him to elaborate. She sat with it. Ronan came down from the meeting 2 hours and 40 minutes after it started. He crossed the lobby toward her, and she stood up and he looked not fine, exactly, but intact. The controlled surface holding, the eyes carrying something tired that had been there for a while and was now allowed to be visible. How did it go? She asked. Mendez is thorough, he said. I know. I talked to her for 2 hours. Something in his face moved. She told me. What did she say? That you were the most efficient witness she'd interviewed in 6 years. A pause. And that she didn't understand how you ended up in this situation, and was reserving judgment on whether that reflected well or poorly on your decision-making. Fair, Audrey said. They walked out of the building into a Philadelphia December that had committed fully to being terrible. The cold had the particular quality of early winter in the Northeast, not the sustained deep freeze of January, but the aggressive, surprised cold of a city that had been ambushed by the season and wasn't handling it graciously. She put her collar up. Ronan walked beside her. Neither of them spoke for half a block. Sterling Vane, she said. What about him? He's still out there. Ronan said nothing. Blaine is contained, she said. Mendez has the documentation. The federal situation is being managed. But Vane was Blaine's partner, which means he had access to the same information Blaine had. Including about me. She paused. Including about the Foundation. I know, Ronan said. So what happens with Vane? Sound like green wood splitting. Ronan stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were on a downtown sidewalk with people moving around in cold cities going somewhere that was inside. A bus went by. Somewhere above them, a window unit was running despite the temperature, rattling in its frame. Sterling Vane has been positioning to take over my operations for 2 years, Ronan said. Blaine gave him the intelligence he needed to think that was achievable. Now Blaine is gone, the intelligence has been compromised, and Vane knows that. He looked at her steadily. He's going to move soon. Not through manipulation this time. Directly, she said, yes. She looked at him. You've been expecting this. I've been preparing for it, he said. There's a difference. What does preparing look like? He was quiet for a moment. It looks like what Dash has been building for 3 months, while Blaine thought Dash was recovering quietly. Another pause. Financial documentation, surveillance material, communication intercepts. Everything connecting Vane to the Carradine arrangement, to Dash's kidnapping, to 3 other incidents in the last 2 years that federal investigators have opened files on, but not enough to close. You're going to give it to Mendez. Most of it, Ronan said. But there's a window, a specific one. If Vane moves before we can get everything organized and delivered, the window closes. He looked at her directly. He has people watching the foundation. She heard that. Since when? Since Carver Street. He knows Blaine failed. He's trying to understand why, which means he's watching everything Blaine was watching. A pause. I didn't want to tell you until I knew what he was going to do with it. You promised me real time, she said. I know, he said. This is real time. She breathed out through her nose. The cold air took the breath and made it visible. What's the window? 48 hours, possibly less. And if he moves on the foundation before you get the documentation to Mendez, then we deal with what happens, Ronan said. Which is why I'm telling you now instead of after. She looked at the street, at the gray sky above the buildings, the particular flat light of a December afternoon in a northeastern city, the world going about its business in the normal registers of ordinary life, uncomplicated by any of this. Then let's not wait for 48 hours, she said. The next 18 hours moved in the compressed, relentless rhythm of a situation that had stopped being theoretical. Dash worked through the night on the documentation she knew, because Ronan told her, because Ronan was also working through the night, and because she was at the clinic at 6A. The next morning, and the circles under her own eyes in the bathroom mirror confirmed that she'd slept approximately 3 hours. She ran morning intake at the clinic, 4 patients, 2 routine, 1 requiring a referral, 1 who needed more time than she had, and got it anyway, and she watched the street outside with a level of attention she didn't perform for the patients. At 10 a.m. her phone buzzed. Ronan Vane moved up his timeline. Tonight. She stared at the message for 4 seconds. Then she typed, "How do you know?" Dash intercepted a communication 40 minutes ago. Where does that leave the documentation? A pause that was longer than she wanted. 80% complete. We need 3 more hours. She looked at the clinic. At her 2 nurses, both currently occupied. At the 4 walls she'd built into something real. Then I'll give you 3 hours, she typed. How? She looked at the street outside again. At the car parked 2 buildings down that had been there since she'd arrived, engine off, single occupant, not a resident's car, wrong plates, for the neighborhood. I'll keep the clinic running and visible. If he has people watching, they see normal operations. Nothing to escalate about. Another pause, Audrey. Ronan. If something happens, 3 hours, she typed. Get it done. The next 3 hours were the longest of her professional life, and she had worked through a 12-patient trauma surge with a staff of 4, so she had a meaningful baseline. She ran the clinic with absolute, meticulous normalcy. She was present for every patient interaction. She completed documentation she'd been behind on for 2 weeks. She made 2 follow-up calls she'd been meaning to make. She did not look at the car down the street more than once every 20 minutes, and when she looked at it, she looked the way you looked at something unremarkable, casually, without letting the looking mean anything on her face. At 12:47 p.m., the car was still there. At 1:15 p.m., a second car appeared at the far end of the block. She texted Ronan without looking like she was texting. Second vehicle. East End. The response came in 40 seconds, seen. 20 more minutes. 20 minutes. She was in the middle of redressing a laceration on a 60-year-old man named Arthur who had done something inadvisable with a kitchen knife and was philosophical about it when her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it ring. It rang again. She handed Arthur a piece of gauze and said, "Press that firmly," and stepped to the corner of the room. Ms. Bellamy. The voice was one she hadn't heard before. Smooth, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who had never in their adult life been kept waiting for anything. "My name is Sterling Vane." She held the phone against her ear and looked at Arthur, who was pressing his gauze and watching her, with the concerned attention of a patient who could tell something was happening that wasn't about his hand. "I'm with a patient," she said. "I'll be brief," Vane said. "I'd like you to close your clinic for the afternoon and come speak with me. I have some concerns about the Foundation's financial structure that I think we can resolve privately. I have patients scheduled until 4. They can reschedule." "Medical care isn't generally, Ms. Bellamy," Vane said, with the quiet authority of someone who had stopped being patient about 3 sentences ago. and was now communicating that. I'm going to be direct. I know where Ronan Whitlock is right now. I know what Dashiell Merrick has been assembling for the past 3 months. And I know that the window in which any of it matters to anyone is considerably shorter than they currently believe. A pause. Come speak with me. Bring nothing. Tell no one. She looked at Arthur. He looked at her. She smiled at him, the professional smile, the one that said everything's fine, and I'm in control, and you don't need to worry, and held up one finger. Where? She said. Vane gave her an address, downtown. A hotel, the kind with a lobby that looked like money and staff trained to not notice things. 1 hour, he said, alone. The call ended. She finished redressing Arthur's laceration. She walked him through aftercare instructions with complete, unhurried attention. She walked him to the door and watched him leave. Then she went to the back office and called Ronan. He answered before it rang. He called you, Ronan said. It wasn't a question. He knows you're working on the documentation. He knows Dash is involved. He said the window is shorter than you think. She paused. He wants me at the Harrington Hotel downtown in 1 hour. Alone. So I'm not going, she said. I want that established. I'm not going. No, Ronan said. But he's going to move if I don't show. And if he moves, I know. How close is the documentation? Dash, she heard him address the room. A pause. Dash says 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Get it to Mendez, she said now. Whatever's done is done. Don't wait for the rest. The rest matters. 12 minutes might as well be 12 hours if Vane moves in the next 2. She was looking at the street through the back office window. The 2 cars were still there. A third had appeared at the west end of the block while she'd been with Arthur. You have enough. Send what you have. A long pause. Aud Ronan, send it. She heard him exhale, then, Dash. Send everything that's packaged now. A pause. Yes, now. She heard Dash's voice in the background, too far from the phone to make out words, then the quick sound of keys. Sent, Ronan said. It's going to Mendez directly. How long before she can act on it? It depends on... Rough estimate, 2 hours minimum, if she moves fast. She looked at the 3 cars on the street. 2 hours. Then we need to keep Vane occupied for 2 hours. A pause. How she thought about it for 3 seconds. In the critical care world, 3 seconds of deliberate thinking in an emergency was a luxury. She used all 3. I'll call him back, she said. Tell him I need 2 hours. That I have patience, I can't leave immediately. That I'll meet him at 4. He'll believe it enough to wait and see, she said. Because the alternative is moving on the foundation directly, which has federal attention on it now and is therefore considerably less useful to him as leverage than a voluntary meeting with me would be. He's a strategist. He'll take the option that preserves his options. Silence. That's a reasonable read, Ronan said carefully. I know it is. She paused. But I need you somewhere between me and the Harrington Hotel in 2 hours. Not in the lobby, not visible, but close. I'll be there, he said. Cutter 2, and Dash stays where he is until Mendez confirms receipt. Agreed. She called Vane back. He answered in 2 rings. She said she had patience. She couldn't responsibly leave before 3:30, and that she would meet him at 4 p.m. She said it in the tone she used for difficult conversations with difficult people who needed to believe they were in control of the situation, calm, cooperative on the surface, firm about the specific thing that mattered. Vane was silent for a moment. 4 o'clock, he said. Don't be late. She texted Ronan, 4 o'clock, Harrington Hotel. 2 hours. Then she went back to the front of the clinic and told her nurses she was stepping out for an errand at 3:30 and to call her if anything critical came up before then. She ran afternoon intake for 2 hours and 12 minutes. The Harrington Hotel lobby was the kind of expensive that had given up being showy about it. Deep carpets, low lighting, the smell of fresh flowers and climate control, and the money that bought both. The staff moved with the frictionless efficiency of people very well paid to be invisible. Audrey arrived at 3:58. She was wearing her clinic clothes dark scrub pants, a heavy coat, her hospital badge clipped to the collar out of habit she hadn't broken. She looked like what she was, a medical professional who had come from work and had not changed to make anyone feel important. She'd had 2 texts from Ronan on the way over. The first, Mendez confirmed receipt. She's moving. The second, 12 minutes later, we're positioned. East side of the building, street level. Don't look for us. She hadn't looked. The front desk directed her to a private meeting room on the second floor. The walk up the stairs gave her 90 seconds to run through the architecture of what she needed to do and what she needed to avoid doing, which was mostly the same architecture she used before a complicated, patient interaction. Know what you're walking into. Know what you need. Know which things you can give and which things you can't. The meeting room was small. Round table, 4 chairs, a window facing the street below. Sterling Vane was already there. He was younger than she'd expected. Early 50s, but the kind of early 50s that money maintained, carefully lean, well-dressed, a face that had learned to communicate authority by removing everything else from it. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't anticipated, and gestured toward the chair across from him with the courtesy of someone who had decided that what courtesy was a useful tool and had deployed it for so long it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "sit down." She sat. He sat across from her. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at her with the focused, evaluative attention of someone who had been given a description of a person and was comparing the description to the reality. "You're not what I expected," he said. "People say that," Audrey said. "Blaine described you as a complication," Vanes said. "I think he meant it neutrally, a factor that altered the expected outcome. But I looked at what you built, and complication seems insufficient." "What word would you use?" He smiled. It reached his eyes in a way that was technically genuine and contextually unsettling. "Architect," he said. "You built something real in the middle of something very complicated, and you built it so that removing it would cause visible harm to visible people, which makes it very difficult to use as a weapon without looking like the person using a medical foundation as a weapon." He paused. "Which is either very clever or very principled, and I suspect it's both." "It's a medical clinic," Audrey said. "That's the whole answer." "Of course," Vaning said. "That's what makes it elegant." He leaned back slightly. "I'm not here to threaten the foundation, Ms. Bellamy. I want you to understand that. What Blaine was doing that approach, it's not mine." "Then what's your approach?" He looked at her steadily. "Ronan is finished," he said. "Not because of me specifically. Because of what the federal documentation, the Carradine situation, and the resulting attention mean for how he can operate going forward. Even if Mendez closes the Carradine case cleanly, Ronan's name is now attached to a federal investigation. His operational capacity is permanently reduced." A pause. "He's smart enough to know that." "I'm not here to talk about Ronan," Audrey said. "I know," Vane said. "I'm here to talk about the foundation." She looked at him. "I want to fund it," he said, "legitimately. A substantial donation, properly documented, through a corporate entity that has no direct connection to anything that would complicate your federal optics." He paused. "Enough to fully endow the foundation's first 3 years of operation. Independent of Ronan, independent of anything he's connected to. Just a donation to a medical organization doing work that's demonstrably valuable." She understood immediately. It wasn't a threat. It was a replacement. He was offering to become what Ronan had been, then a financial infrastructure, underneath something legitimate, the connection that gave him access without being visible. He was offering it cleanly, with a bow, in a hotel room with good lighting and no men at the door, because he'd learned from Blaine's approach and had concluded that subtlety was more durable than force. "No," she said. Vane looked at her without visible reaction. "The foundation benefits. The foundation doesn't benefit from money that comes with strings." "I can't see," she said. "That's what you're offering. Not a donation, a relationship. And I don't want the relationship." "The strings are invisible," he said. "That's the point. The strings are always invisible until they're not," Audrey said. "I've spent the last 7 months learning what invisible strings look like from inside them." She looked at him directly. "I know what you're trying to build, and I know why having a legitimate medical foundation in your orbit is useful to you." And the answer is no. Vane was quiet for a moment. The window behind him showed the street below. She could see the edge of the block, the parked cars, the December pedestrians moving in their coats. She couldn't see Ronan or Cutter. She didn't look. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Vane said. His voice had changed. Not threatening, but the courtesy had thinned. The real texture of the conversation was showing through it. I'm making it accurate, she said. Ronan is done, Vane said. Whether you want to believe that or not. The question is what the Foundation looks like when he's gone, and who's positioned to help it survive that transition. He paused. I'm offering a clean option. Ronan isn't done, Audrey said. Ms. Bellamy, he's in the process of providing federal investigators with complete documentation of your arrangement with Blaine Carradine, your role in Dashiell Merrick's kidnapping, and 3 additional incidents connected to your operations that investigators have had open files on for 2 years. She watched his face. Mendez confirmed receipt approximately 90 minutes ago. The room went very still. Vane's expression did something she'd seen in Blaine's face. In the Carver Street building, the recalibration. The internal adjustment around a structural fact that had changed. You came here to buy time, he said. I came here because you called me, Audrey said. The time was already bought before I walked in. Something moved across Vane's face. Not rage, he was too controlled for rage, the kind of controlled that came from long practice. But underneath the control, something that had the temperature of it. He reached into his jacket. Audrey's body went tight, her hands on the table edge, the chair scraping back half an inch before she stopped it. The full system alarm of a person who has just processed threat and is running the 4-second calculation of how to respond. What he pulled out was a phone. He looked at the screen. His jaw tightened. He put the phone face down on the table. You understand, he said quietly, that documentation changes the legal situation. It doesn't change the operational one. I know, she said. Ronan still has enemies, Vane said. People who aren't me. Who weren't part of the Carradine arrangement. Who have their own reasons and their own timelines. His voice was very level. And now he's going to be visible, in a way that federal involvement makes permanent. Which makes everyone he cares about visible. She heard the shift. Away from negotiation, into the territory of a man who had just had something taken from him, and was recalculating what was still available. You should leave, she said. You should think carefully. The door opened. Ronan came in first. He moved the way he moved through every room with the directional, complete attention of someone who had already decided what the room contained before he entered it. He looked at Vane. He looked at Audrey. He looked at Vane's face and at the phone face down on the table. Cutter was in the doorway. Vane looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Vane. The two of them existed in that mutual assessment for several seconds, 2 men who had been in proximity for 2 years, who had been circling the same territory from different positions, who were now in the same room with no intermediaries and no pretense and no document or phone call between them. It's done, Ronan said. Quiet, not gloating, just factual. Nothing is done, Vane said. Mendez has everything. Your federal contact, the one Blaine was using, he's going to have a difficult afternoon. Ronan moved to the table. He didn't sit down. He stood at the corner of it, equidistant from Vane and Audrey, and looked at Vane with the specific quality of attention that was not hate and not triumph, and was therefore harder to respond to. You built this on Blaine's intelligence, his read on my vulnerabilities, my operations, my people. And Blaine was wrong about most of it. He wasn't wrong about her, Vane said. His eyes moved to Audrey. No, Ronan said, he wasn't. He said it without deflection, without the instinct to minimize that she'd watched him fight against for 7 months. He said it the way he said, true things flat, complete, with nothing added to soften them. Vane looked at Audrey. You understand what you've done to him. By existing in his orbit, you've made him the most predictable he's ever been. The most stoppable. And yet here we are, Audrey said. Vane's jaw tightened. You can leave, Ronan said. Or you can stay and have a much less comfortable afternoon. Either way, what Mendez has doesn't change. He paused. Go home, Sterling. Get ahead of what's coming. That's the only move you have left. Vane stood. He was the kind of man, Audrey understood, who had never left a room without having the last word. She could see him running through the available options and finding them all inadequate, every possible exit line checked against the reality of the room, and found to fall short of the dignity he wanted the moment to have. He picked up his phone. He walked past Ronan without looking at him. Past Cutter in the doorway, who moved aside with the specific unhurriedness of someone communicating that they were choosing to move aside. Down the corridor, the door closed. Ronan stood at the corner of the table, looking at the space Vane had occupied. He was breathing carefully. She knew his breathing, now the controlled, slow register of someone who had been holding something compressed for a very long time, and was only partway through the process of releasing it. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "Your shoulder is fine. It was fine 2 days ago." She paused. "Are you?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave things that deserved it. "Not yet," he said. "Ask me in a few days." She understood what he meant. The documentation was sent. Mendez was moving. Vane was walking out of a hotel room toward an afternoon that was going to be complicated, but none of that resolved immediately or cleanly or without residue. The legal situation would take months. The operational aftermath would take longer. And the world that had created this situation didn't stop creating itself just because one specific configuration of it had been dismantled. He knew that. She knew it too. "There are people still watching the Foundation," she said. "Vane's people. They'll pull back when he tells them to, and he's going to be very focused on his own situation in the next 48 hours. And after that? After that is different," Ronan said. She looked at the window. The street below was running at its ordinary register pedestrians. Traffic, the flat December light, sitting evenly on everything, without preference or significance. "You said you've been thinking about after," she said. He was quiet. "Dash told me," she said. "He said you'd been thinking about it for a while." "Dash talks more than people expect," Ronan said. It wasn't a complaint. It was something closer to fond. "What does after look like?" she asked. He was silent for long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the window, the same view she'd been looking at, the same ordinary street, the same flat light with the expression of someone who had spent a long time knowing the answer to a question and was deciding whether saying it out loud would make it real, in the way that was frightening or in the way that was necessary. "It looks like less," he said. "Of most things," he paused. "And more of the things that have mattered, recently, that I've been pretending I could keep separate from everything else." She waited. "I can't keep doing what I've been doing," he said. "Not because of the legal situation. Not because of Mendez. Because," he stopped. "Started differently. I told you at the Carver Street window that Blaine wasn't wrong about what you meant to me. And I told you it wasn't a vulnerability. It was just what's true." He looked at her. "I've been living in a world that treats those two things as the same. And I don't want to live there anymore." The room was very quiet. Cutter, she noticed, had left the doorway at some point and closed the door behind him. She hadn't heard him go. "What are you saying?" she asked. Ronan looked at her with the complete, undefended attention of someone who had spent enormous effort managing his own visibility and had decided in this room, in this moment, to stop managing it. "I'm saying I need to dismantle the parts of what I've built that have kept creating this situation," he said. "The criminal operations, the network, the arrangements that have been generating enemies for 15 years. All of it. A pause. I have legitimate businesses. Real ones. They can operate without what's underneath them. It'll be different. It'll be less. It'll also be mine. Survivable," she said quietly. "For the people I don't want to lose," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the elevator. About a man pressing no floor. About conditions negotiated in a stopped metal box between two people who had no earthly reason to trust each other and had done it anyway, incrementally, scene by scene, room by room, over the course of a year that had remade both of them in ways neither had fully accounted for. "You're going to need to do it completely," she said. "Not partially, not strategically. Complete divestment from everything that isn't legitimate. Documented. Transparent. I know, it's going to take time. And Mendez is going to be watching. I know that too." "And Dash has been ready," Ronan said. "He's been ready longer than I have." She believed that. She believed all of it. A sound, and she was standing in a hotel room in December with the street below, going about its ordinary life, and a man in front of her who had just said out loud the thing he'd been building toward for 7 months and was waiting with the particular patience of someone who understood how to wait without performing waiting. For her to say something back. Sound green. She thought about what she needed to say. She thought about what was true, which was the same thing, and found that it was actually not complicated, that all the complicated parts had been the approach to it, the management of it. A sound like the careful professional distance she'd maintained for 7 months because the situation required it, and that the situation no longer required it in the same way, and that she was very tired of distance that had outlived its usefulness. When this is over, she said. When Mendez closes the case and the operations are dismantled, and it's actually genuinely different. Yes, Ronan said, I haven't finished. I know, he said. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she almost laughed, not quite, but close, the internal precursor to it, the body's recognition of something that had been heavy becoming unexpectedly lighter. You're very sure of yourself, she said. I'm sure of you, he said. There's a difference. Outside the window, the December light was doing what December light did in the late afternoon, flattening, going amber at the edges, the day starting its early retreat. The street below was full of people going home. She had a clinic to close. She had 2 nurses to pay and a pharmaceutical delivery to log and a follow-up call to make about a patient named Arthur who had done something inadvisable with a kitchen knife. She understood for the first time in 7 months, with something approaching clarity, a life that was hers, built by her hands, running on her principles, full of the kind of specific, particular, irreplaceable people she had spent a year learning to recognize for what they were. She had all of that, and she had, standing in front of her in a hotel room in December, with the worst of it finally behind them, and the rest of it still to be built, a man who had just asked her, in the most roundabout and honest way she'd ever been asked anything, to be part of what came next. She picked up her jacket from the chair. Close everything properly, she said. No loose ends, no half measures, agreed, Ronan said. And when it's done, she looked at him one more time, with the full, unmanaged attention she'd been careful with for 7 months and was done being careful with. Ask me again. She walked to the door. Ronan stood at the corner of the table and watched her go with the expression of a man who had been given something he'd spent a long time not letting himself want, and who was, for the first time, in as long as either of them could account for, not going to talk himself out of wanting it. She opened the door. Below on the street, Cutter was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking at the sky with the patient attention of a man who had learned that waiting was just time, and time was just what happened while people figured out the things that mattered. She came down the stairs. Done, Cutter asked. Getting there, she said. She walked out into the December cold. Behind her, upstairs, she heard Ronan's footsteps moving toward the door. Mendez moved faster than Audrey had expected. Not recklessly, the DOJ did not do reckless, and Carla Mendez in particular struck Audrey as a woman who had built her entire professional reputation on the distance between fast and sloppy. But she moved with the specific efficiency of someone who had been working a case with incomplete materials for 2 years and had just received the piece that made the picture coherent. By the following morning, Sterling Vane's primary corporate entity had been served. By afternoon, 2 of his senior associates were in federal custody. By the end of the week, the financial infrastructure connecting Vane's operation to Blaine Carradine's arrangement, the money, the logistics. A sound like greenwood splitting, the 3 had been sitting without resolution, had been formally connected in a way that was going to be very difficult to argue apart in a courtroom. Audrey knew most of this secondhand. Ronan told her what he could. Dash told her more than Ronan probably intended. The rest she read in the kind of careful, between-the-lines news coverage that appeared when something significant happened in the city's criminal architecture, and the journalists who covered it knew better than to be too specific, too fast. She ran the clinic. She ran it the way she'd always run it, 6 days a week. Intake at 7. Close at 6 unless something required otherwise, which it often did. She hired a 3rd nurse, in January, a woman named Priya, who had 12 years of emergency medicine and a directness about patient care that Audrey recognized and immediately respected. She applied for additional grants. She started a conversation with the city's community health board about a possible expansion to a 2nd location in the Northeast. She did the work. The specific, daily, incremental work of building something that helped people without drama, without crisis, without anyone trying to use it as a weapon against someone else. It was, she found, considerably easier when the weapon threat had been removed. She did not see Ronan for 6 weeks. This was deliberate hers more than his. She'd told him to close everything properly, no loose ends, no half measures. And she'd meant it, and she'd understood when she said it that closing things properly meant he needed to be occupied with the closing rather than with her, and that she needed to be occupied with the clinic rather than with watching him do it. They texted. Practical things, mostly updates on the federal situation, a question he had about the foundation's board structure that she answered in 3 paragraphs, a message she sent at 11 p.m. one Tuesday that said only how is dash, and that received back in 40 seconds, annoying everyone, which means excellent. She knew he was doing it. She could track it in the negative space, the things that stopped happening, the concerns that stopped circulating at the edges of her professional life. The car that had been watching the clinic's block for 3 weeks disappeared on a Wednesday morning and didn't come back. A conversation she'd been dreading with the foundation's independent auditor turned out to be straightforward because the financial documentation was, by that point, genuinely clean. The second clinic nurse, who had known more about the arrangements and the background than Audrey had ever formally told her, came in one morning and said simply, "It's different. This week." And Audrey said yes, and neither of them elaborated. It was different. Mendez called her in February. She was at the clinic, between patients, eating a granola bar over the supply inventory she was trying to reconcile, and she answered with the particular reflex of someone who had been half expecting the call without letting herself count on it. "The Carradine case closed this morning," Mendez said. "Guilty plea, 22 counts. He took the deal his attorney recommended and avoided trial." A pause. "The Vane indictment stands. That one goes to trial, probably in the fall. And the foundation? The investigation into the foundation's financial structure has been formally closed. No further inquiry." Another pause shorter. "For what it's worth, Miss Bellamy, and I don't say this often, what you built is legitimately what you said it was. That's rarer than it should be." Audrey looked at the granola bar in her hand. "Thank you for telling me. One more thing," Mendez said. "Ronan Whitlock's cooperation with this investigation, and I'm choosing that word deliberately, was complete. He provided everything we needed and accepted the terms of the agreement without negotiation. A beat. That's also rarer than it should be." Audrey said nothing for a moment. "I know," she said. "The agreement includes permanent divestment from certain operations, ongoing financial disclosure, and a 2-year reporting requirement," Mendez said. He agreed to all of it before his attorney finished reading it. "Sounds like him," Audrey said. Mendez was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone deciding whether to say one more thing. "He asked about you," she said, "in our last meeting. Not about the case. He asked whether the investigation's closure would affect the foundation's grant eligibility." Audrey looked at the supply inventory without seeing it. "What did you tell him?" "That it wouldn't," Mendez said. "And that he should ask you himself." A pause. "Goodbye, Miss Bellamy." The call ended. Audrey put the granola bar down and sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment. The clinic was doing what it did at midday, the particular rhythm of a place in the middle of its purpose. Voices in the waiting area, the sound of Priya in the exam room talking to a patient with the focused level attention that Audrey had hired her for. She picked up her phone and sent one text. Mendez called. "It's closed." The response came in less than a minute, "I know. She called me first." A pause then. "I was waiting to see if you'd call." She almost smiled. "You could have called me." "I could have," he wrote back. "I was asking you to." She looked at that for a moment. Then, "Are you done?" A longer pause. She could feel the weight of it, not hesitation, but the gravity of a true answer being assembled carefully. "Yes," he wrote, "it's done." She read it twice. "Then ask me," she wrote. Response took 4 minutes. She wasn't watching the clock, but she noticed the 4 minutes anyway, the way she noticed most, without making it mean more than it was, just registering the fact of it. When the message came, it was short. "Dinner. Tonight. Somewhere ordinary." She wrote back, 7. "You pick." She put the phone in her pocket and went back to her patients. Picked a place in Fishtown that had been there for 30 years and looked like it worn wooden tables, a bar that was more functional than decorative, a menu that was 2 pages and didn't need to be longer. The kind of place where the food was the point and the atmosphere was whatever the people at the tables made it. She got there at 7, and he was already there. Sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall, which she recognized as habit, the lifelong positioning of someone trained to see every entrance, and he was wearing a dark jacket over a plain shirt, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like someone who was not working at being composed. He just looked like a person at a table. She sat down across from him. The server came. They ordered without performing the ordering. She got what she wanted. He got what he wanted. And neither of them did the elaborate courtesy dance of people on a first date trying to demonstrate who they were. This was not a first date. It was something harder to name and more durable. "Tell me what done actually looks like," she said when the server had gone. He told her. Not the legal summary, she had that from Mendez, but the operational reality. The logistics companies had been restructured with professional management and independent boards. The arrangements that had run underneath them were terminated. The network of people and obligations that had constituted his criminal operation over 15 years had not been cleanly, nothing this size unwound, cleanly, systematically closed. With the cooperation of people who understood that cooperating was the functional choice, and the very small number who hadn't cooperated had become, by that point, someone else's problem in a federal sense. "The legitimate businesses are still running," he said. Real estate, hospitality, the freight logistics, that was always actual freight logistics. They're profitable. They don't need what was underneath them. They never really did. He paused. I kept them running what was underneath them because it was how it had built them, and I didn't know how to stop. Without, I told myself there were reasons. There were always reasons. "What changed?" she asked. He looked at her with the directness she'd come to understand was the most honest thing about him, the moments when the management dropped entirely, and he just said what was true. "You built something real in the middle of it," he said. "And it kept being real, and it made everything around it look like what it was, which was a version of real that required constant maintenance to sustain." He paused. "I got tired of the maintenance." She understood that. She'd watched it over 7 months, the specific exhaustion of someone who was very good at something that was costing them more than it was returning. "Dash," she said, "he's staying. No hesitation. He's transitioning with the logistics operation. He has a head for it, the legitimate version, and he wanted to." A pause, and something moved in his face. "He told me, about 2 months ago, that he'd been waiting 3 years for me to make this decision. That he'd been ready whenever I was. He told me something similar," Audrey said. "About you." Ronan looked at her. "What did he say?" "That you'd been thinking about after for a while," she said. "And that you'd been ready longer than you knew." He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them, other tables, other conversations, the ordinary texture of people eating dinner on a February night in Philadelphia. A couple arguing quietly near the bar. A family with a child who kept dropping a spoon. The server refilling water glasses with the automatic competence of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "He's not wrong," Ronan said. She believed him. She'd believed him since the hotel room in December, and probably before that, if she was honest about it, believed the specific thing he was saying, which was that the decision had been building in him for longer than the situation with Vane and Blaine had made it visible. That she had not caused it, but had made it legible, in the way that sometimes another person clarified a truth you'd been carrying, without a name for it. They ate, they talked, not about cases or documentation, or the Foundation's grant status. About the restaurant, he'd been coming here for 12 years, since before he could have afforded it, because the owner had given him its 27 and broke in a particular way and had never made it a story. About her work, a patient she'd seen that week, who reminded her why she'd chosen nursing over medicine, the specific texture of presence it required, being with people in their bodies rather than above them, with a chart. About Dash, who had apparently taken up running during his recovery, and was now aggressively committed to it in the way people became aggressively committed to things they discovered late. About ordinary things. She'd forgotten what ordinary things felt like in conversation, being such a teen. The Sasserman for 7 months, almost entirely not ordinary. A sound like green wood splitting. It turned out that ordinary things felt in this specific combination like something she had been looking forward to without knowing she was looking forward to it. Facetine persons. At some point the restaurant thinned out, and the server stopped coming as frequently, and the couple near the bar had resolved, or at least suspended, whatever they'd been arguing about. "You said ask me again," Ronan said. He said it in the tone of someone completing a sentence that had been started in December. "I did," she said. He looked at her. "I'm asking." She looked back at him, at the face she'd been reading for 7 months, the controlled surface, and what moved beneath it, the specific tells she'd learned the way. You learn the sign of a condition, not from a textbook but from sustained. Careful attention to a particular patient over time. She knew his face now. She knew the tell for genuine concern versus managed concern, for the exhaustion he didn't perform versus the composure he did, for the moments when something mattered to him more than he intended to let on. He was not performing composure right now. "Yes," she said. He didn't move for a moment. Then he reached across the table, and his hand covered hers, not dramatically, not with the gestural excess of a cinematic moment, just the specific, present weight of a person's hand choosing to make contact, and she turned her hand over beneath his. They stayed there for a while, in the restaurant that had been there for 30 years, while Philadelphia went on being Philadelphia outside the windows, indifferent and continuous and entirely unconcerned with the particular thing that had just been decided at a corner table between two people who had taken the long way to it. The months that followed were not without difficulty. She would have been suspicious of aversion without difficulty. She'd spent enough time in the ICU to know that recovery wasn't linear, that the absence of crisis was not the same as health, and that rebuilding something, a body, an organization, a life, required the same sustained attention as the emergency that had made the rebuilding necessary. The Vane trial was scheduled for October. Ronan's testimony would be required. She knew that, and she knew what it meant, the renewed visibility, the old world asserting its claim on the present one, the specific unpleasantness of being in a courtroom, talking about things you had done or allowed or built, in front of people whose job was to hold those things to account. She went with him to the first meeting, with the prosecuting attorney. Not because she was involved in the case, she wasn't, and she was clear about that. Because he'd asked, in the oblique way, he asked things that mattered to him, by saying it wasn't necessary for her to come, which she had learned was how he said, "I would like you there." She came. She sat in the waiting room while he was in the meeting, and read patient intake forms she'd brought on her tablet, and drank bad coffee from a machine in the hallway, and did not catastrophize, which was a skill she was still working on. He came out 90 minutes later, looking like the meeting had been what it was draining. Precise, the particular kind of honest that required excavating things you'd spent years not examining. "How was it?" she asked. "Necessary. That's not an answer. It's the accurate one." She handed him the second cup of bad coffee she'd gotten from the machine. He looked at it. "This is terrible," he said. "I know," she said. "Drink it anyway." He drank it anyway. In March, the foundation opened its second location. It was in the Northeast, in a neighborhood that had 3 times the median need and a third of the existing after-hours care infrastructure, and it was the product of 14 months of grant applications and community board conversations, and a partnership with a hospital system that had taken 6 months to negotiate and required Audrey to be in 4. Meetings that she would not describe as enjoyable. The opening was not an event. She didn't do events. She did a first-day patients booked starting at 7, staff in place, by 6:30, the particular functional first morning of a medical operation that was now open and treating people, and therefore doing the only thing that mattered. Ronan came by at noon. A sound like green wood splitting. He stood outside the entrance for a moment before coming in, and she saw him through the window, standing on the sidewalk, looking at the sign she'd commissioned from the same artist who'd done the first location, hands in his jacket pockets, with the expression of someone processing something quietly. He came inside. She was between patients. She walked out to the waiting area. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said. "You would have told me not to," he said. "I would have said it wasn't necessary," she said. Same thing. She looked at him. "How does it look?" He looked around the waiting room. 4 patients, a children's area in the corner that Preya had suggested and sourced herself, a reception desk that was clean and organized and occupied by someone who was doing the job well. He looked at all of it, with the same attention he brought to everything. The inventory, that was never casual. "Like something that's going to be here in 20 years, he said. She thought about that. About what 20 years meant, the specific weight of that timeline, the accumulation of patience and decisions, and ordinary, difficult days that would constitute it. About what it meant to build something with that kind of intentional permanence, the foundation's name on the door, her own name in the documents, her own choices throughout. "Yeah," she said. "That's what I'm going for." A patient called her from the hallway. She held up one finger in Ronan's direction, the same gesture she'd used in the Harrington Hotel with Arthur, the one that said, "I'm here," one moment, and went back to work. He was still there when she came out 40 minutes later, sitting in the waiting room with a cup of the Foundation's coffee, which was considerably better than the machine in the prosecuting attorney's hallway, reading something on his phone with the focused, economical attention he gave to reading. He looked like a person waiting. Just that. She sat down beside him. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at the room, a woman with a toddler on her lap who had fallen asleep mid-wait. An older man with a wrapped hand who was being patient in the way older men who worked physical jobs were patient not passively, but with the active containment of someone accustomed to pain that needed to wait its turn. A younger woman filling out intake forms with the focused care of someone for whom paperwork in English required effort. All of them here because they had somewhere to be that was real and open and not going to ask them questions they couldn't answer. "Do you remember the first time we met?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "Elevator," he said. "You had an empty coffee cup. You pressed no floor. I had my floor handled. You were terrifying," she said. "I know," he said. He said it without apology, without performance. Just acknowledgement. "You're less terrifying now," she said. He thought about that. Probably accurate. "I'm not sure it's a bad thing." "Probably accurate," he said again, and something in his face had the quality she'd seen first in room 714 when he'd crouched in front of Dash's wheelchair and said nothing, the thing that was real in him, underneath the constructed surface, the warmth he didn't perform, but also didn't always protect, visible most clearly in the moments when he wasn't watching himself. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He stayed very still for a second, the same split-second stilling of a person receiving something they hadn't braced for, and then his posture adjusted, not dramatically, just settling around the contact. They sat in the waiting room of the Bellamy Night Care Foundation's second location while the afternoon ran its course around them, and it was thoroughly, completely ordinary, and it was exactly what she had built this place to be. The Vane trial ran for 3 weeks in October. It was not pleasant. Trials of that kind weren't. The evidence was extensive. The defense attorneys were competent and motivated, and the weeks of testimony required a sustained revisitation of things that were finished, but not yet, somehow, entirely in the past. Ronan testified for 2 full days. She didn't attend those sessions. She'd asked if he wanted her there, and he'd said no, not the oblique version, the direct one. She understood. There were things a person needed to face in a room without the people who mattered most met watching, because the watching changed what the facing cost. She ran the clinic. Each evening of those 2 days, she was home when he arrived. She didn't ask how it went. He told her what he wanted to tell her, which was not everything, and she listened to what he told her without requiring the rest. She made dinner both nights, not because she was better at it than he was, which was debatable, but because it was something to do that was concrete and present and uncomplicated, and sometimes that was what the moment required. After the second day, they sat at the kitchen table, with the dishes still between them, and he was quiet for a long time in the way he was quiet when he was processing rather than withholding. "There was a man in the courtroom," he said finally. "He'd been involved with the Vane operation. He testified against Vane, he paused. He has a family, a daughter who's 7. He made decisions that put her at risk for years without fully. He stopped again. He knows that now. He's been knowing it. She waited. I recognized it, Ronan said. The knowing. She looked at him across the kitchen table. What did you do with the knowing? He was quiet for a moment. I'm still doing it, he said. I think that's the answer. You don't arrive somewhere with it. You just keep carrying it and making different decisions. She thought about that. About the patients she'd lost in 6 years of critical care, the ones she'd done everything right for and lost anyway, and the very rare ones she'd made a mistake with and lost, and the difference between those two things in terms of what they left behind. The carrying, the different decisions. Yeah, she said. That's how it works. He looked at her. I don't know how to make it lighter. You don't, she said. It doesn't get lighter. You just get stronger, and sometimes that feels like the same thing, and it isn't. He absorbed that. The kitchen was quiet, the building sounds, the street sounds, the ordinary ambient life of an apartment in a city going about its business on a Tuesday night in October. Are you okay? She asked. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about things he intended to answer to honestly. Getting there, he said. She recognized the phrase. She'd said it herself, in the Harrington Hotel lobby, coming down the stairs. Getting there, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over beneath hers. They stayed like that while the city went on outside the window, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Blaine Carradine received his sentence in November. 22 counts, the plea deal's math working out to 11 years. Audrey read about it in a 3-paragraph news item that treated it as the minor footnote it had become the larger story, was the Vane conviction, which had come in the final week of October, and carried considerably more column inches. She showed Ronan the item, not because he needed to see it, he knew, but because she wanted to see his face when he read it. He read it. He set the phone down. How do you feel? She asked. Like it's finished, he said. That's it? That's a lot, he said. Finished isn't nothing. She thought about that. He was right. Finished was substantial. Finished was the thing she'd spent a year and a half working toward, from the elevator at Blackridge to the kitchen table in November, through every room and every conversation and every decision that had cost something and been made anyway. Finished was not a small thing. It is a lot, she said. She went to work. Dash came into the clinic in January for what he called a routine checkup, and what Audrey understood was his annual attempt to demonstrate that he was in better shape than she expected. He was, in fact, in excellent shape. The scar from his abdominal repair was fully healed and had faded to almost nothing. His blood pressure was good. His resting heart rate was the resting heart rate of someone who had aggressively taken up running and refused to stop. You look annoyingly healthy, she told him. I've been told, he said, and the almost grin was fully present, fully secure in a way it hadn't been a year ago. There was something easier in him now. Not softer. Dash was not going to become soft. It wasn't his nature, and she'd stopped expecting it, but less compressed. Less like someone carrying something they hadn't been given permission to set down. The logistics operation, she said. How is it? Legitimate freight logistics is deeply unsexy, he said. It's also incredibly profitable if you do it correctly, which it turns out we always could have done, if certain complicating factors had not been. Dash. It's good, he said. It's actually good. And he said it with the specific quality of something he'd had to try before he could believe it, which was its own kind of honest. Ronan, she said, how is he? Dash looked at her with the expression he used when a question had an obvious answer, and he was choosing between the obvious answer and the more accurate one. He makes dinner on Thursdays, he said. Did he tell you that? No. He started doing it 2 months ago. Goes to the market on Wednesday, makes. He paused. I don't know why I'm telling you this. You probably know. He doesn't tell me things he assumes I'll find out, she said. It's a habit. Dash looked at her. He makes dinner on Thursdays for whoever's around, he said. Last week it was me and Cutter and a woman from the logistics office named Bev, who's 63 and absolutely terrifying. He made pasta. He stopped, shook his head slightly. It was like a regular Thursday. She looked at the exam room wall. At the anatomy chart, Priya had hung there because the patients liked having something to look at. At the ordinary, functional, unremarkable materials of a place where people came to be helped. Regular Thursday, she said. Yeah, Dash said, I know. She finished his checkup. She walked him to the door. He stood on the sidewalk outside the clinic in the January cold, hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at the sign the way he'd looked at the first clinic sign. The first time he'd come in like someone confronting something they hadn't expected to find themselves glad about. You're good, she told him. Come back in 6 months. I'll probably come back sooner, he said. I have questions about this running thing. My left knee. Make an appointment, she said. He grinned the full version, not the almost. He walked on the sidewalk with the easy, recovered stride of someone whose body had been restored to him. She went back inside. The wedding was in April. Not a large one. She had not wanted large, and Ronan had not wanted large, and the only point of brief disagreement had been the location. She'd suggested something simple. He'd agreed, and then his version of simple turned out to be a property he owned outside the city, a house on several acres with a garden that was beginning its spring in the particular, tentative way of early April gardens, everything coming back from the cold in stages, not all at once. She stood in that garden on an April afternoon, with mud on her good shoes from the morning's rain and Ronan beside her and Dash standing with him, and the handful of people who mattered within easy sight, and she thought about the elevator. She thought about it clearly and without nostalgia, not the cinematic version of it, story you'd tell about how it started, but the real version. The 16-hour shift, the empty coffee cup, the man pressing no floor. The specific, unglamorous circumstances of two people who had no reason to be in the same place making a decision that compounded into a life. She'd made the decision that night, for the reason she made most decisions, because someone needed help, and she was there. That was all. That was the whole first reason. The rest of it had accumulated on top of that, built itself out of months of rooms and conversations and choices, until it was what it was now, which was not something she had a single word for and didn't need one. The officiant, a judge who had been recommended by Mendez of all people, was brief and direct. The ceremony lasted 18 minutes. Dash cried. He was very discreet about it and would have denied it to any witness, but she saw it and filed it away as one of the things she was most grateful for about the day. Ronan held her hand through the whole of it with the specific, complete grip of someone who had made a decision and was not performing the making of it. Afterward in the garden, eating food that was good and drinking wine that was good, and standing in the April afternoon with mud on her shoes, she found herself beside him in a moment when the others had drifted to different conversations. He was looking at the garden, at the spring things coming back in their stages. Is this what after looks like? She asked. He looked at her. She knew his face well enough now to know what it was doing, which was the thing it did, when he was about to say something he meant entirely. It's a start, he said. She leaned into him. They stood in the garden while their small wedding continued around them, ordinary and insufficient as description and completely adequate as experience. The years that followed did not arrange themselves into a clean summary. They were years, real ones, with the texture of actual time. The second clinic thrived, and a third became a serious conversation by the end of year 2. The vain conviction held on appeal. Ronan's legitimate businesses ran well under management that didn't require his constant presence, which meant he had time, and he used it in ways she hadn't entirely predicted. He became, quietly and without announcement, a significant donor to 2 workforce development programs in the city's underserved neighborhoods, and when she asked him about it, he said simply that the logistics network had always run on people who deserved better infrastructure than they'd gotten, and he decided to address that directly. Dash ran the freight operation with the focused, slightly aggressive competence he brought to everything he decided mattered. He also ran a 10K in October of the second year, texted Audrey his time with the specific energy of someone expecting recognition, which she provided. Cutter, it turned out, wanted to finish his paramedic certification. He'd stopped in the middle of it years ago for reasons that were no longer relevant. Audrey connected him with a program. He finished in the spring. She still worked the nights occasionally, not as often as she had when the clinic was new. Priya and the third nurse carried more of it now, and the second location had its own nighttime coordinator. And Audrey had made peace with the idea that building something required, eventually, trusting other people to run it. But sometimes she was in the clinic at midnight, with a patient who needed the specific quality of presence she'd spent her career developing. And she was there, and it was the same as it had always been. A person, a patient, a room, the work. Ronan understood this. He'd understood it from the first condition she'd set in the elevator, which was that inside any room where someone needed medical care, the medicine was the priority always, without negotiation. He'd agreed to it then, and he'd meant it, and he went on meaning it, which she discovered was the quiet, ongoing work of a commitment, not the declaration, but the daily maintenance of having meant what you said. He was home on the nights she worked. This required no discussion. He was simply home, and when she came in at whatever hour, the shift concluded, he was either awake or he woke up, and she was either tired enough to sleep immediately or she wasn't, and they had the ordinary negotiations of two people sharing a life that is genuinely shared. One night in March of the third year, they rode the hospital elevator at Blackridge. She was there for a consult. A former colleague had called about a complex patient whose situation intersected with the kind of after-hours care the foundation specialized in, and she'd come to look at the case. Ronan had driven her, which he did when her schedule ran late, and parking was the kind of problem she didn't have time to solve. He came in with her. They rode up together. The elevator was a different one than the one they'd taken. That first night, the hospital had renovated the bank nearest the main entrance in the second year, and the old elevators were gone, replaced with faster, quieter ones that didn't flicker. This one hesitated. Not between floors, just a momentary mechanical stutter at the third floor, the hydraulics considering their options before continuing upward. She felt it. She turned to look at him. He had his hands already raised. "Not me," he said. She laughed. The real kind, unmanaged, not composed for anyone's benefit, the laugh that comes from the place in the chest that has been full long enough to overflow. The elevator reached its floor. The doors opened. She walked out into the hospital corridor, into the particular ambient purpose of the place, the monitors, the voices, the fluorescent lights running at their nighttime register, the ongoing hum of care being provided in every direction, and Ronan walked out beside her, and behind them the elevator doors slid closed without ceremony, indifferent to the history of the people who'd just passed through it. She had a consult to see. She went to see it. He walked beside her down the corridor, hands in his pockets, pace matched to hers, in the specific comfortable way of someone who had learned over years the small adjustments that made presence feel like presence rather than accompaniment. At the nursing station, she stopped and turned to him. "This could take an hour," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't have to wait." "I know," he said again. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The corridor ran on both sides of them, full of its purpose, full of the ongoing difficult work of keeping people alive and functional and cared for. "There's bad coffee," she said. "Vending machine, end of the hall." "I remember," he said. She turned and went to work. Behind her, she heard his footsteps moving toward the end of the hall, not toward the elevator, not toward the exit, toward the vending machine and the plastic chair beside it, and the long patience of someone who understood that waiting, done right, was its own form of being present. She walked into the consultation and did what she had always done, what she had been doing since long before that night in the elevator, what she would go on doing for as long as she was able. She showed up for the person who needed her, with everything she had, and she did not let the difficulty of the situation be a reason not to try. Some things didn't change. The best ones never did.